Close your eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, not yet, but to see. Imagine the air is dry and warm even before the sun has fully risen. The sky above you is not the deep blue you know. It is the color of copper and pale gold. The horizon still pink where the night held on just a little too long. The stars haven't entirely disappeared. There, above the eastern edge of the world, the brightest ones still cling to the sky like they're reluctant to let go. You are standing on a flat rooftop. The rooftop of a small house made of mud bricks. The walls are thick enough to keep out the brutal midday heat, and the surface beneath your bare feet is still cool from the night before. Below you, a narrow street winds between identical houses. The streets of this city smell of fish from the river, of bread beginning to bake somewhere nearby, of animals and dust and the faint sweetness of lotus blossoms carried on the morning breeze from the Nile. This is Egypt. Not the Egypt of golden thrones and jeweled death masks, not the Egypt of kings, whose faces you've seen carved 100 feet high into cliffs of stone. This is the other Egypt, the real one. The Egypt of a woman waking up before her husband to start the bread dough. The Egypt of a young boy carrying a clay pot of water through a street still dark with early morning shadows. The Egypt of a scribe rolling out of bed, rubbing his eyes and wondering whether the overseer will notice he was late finishing yesterday's records. This is the Egypt that held the whole civilization together. And tonight, or this quiet, peaceful hour, wherever you are listening from, we are going to go there. We are going to walk those streets. We are going to sit in those houses, eat that bread, drink that thick, warm beer. We are going to feel the Nile flooding and watch what happens to the fields, see what it means to be a person who will never rule, never be worshipped, never be remembered by name in any grand inscription on any temple wall, and yet whose hands built every single wonder we still talk about today. So settle in, because this story goes back a very long time. Let's talk about time first, just briefly, because it helps. When we say ancient Egypt, we are talking about a civilization that lasted, give or take, 3,000 years. 3,000. The distance from ancient Egypt to the Roman Empire is roughly the same as the distance from the Roman Empire to us, sitting here today. Egypt was already ancient when Julius Caesar visited it. The pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,000 years old when Cleopatra was born. She was, in fact, closer in time to us than she was to the construction of those pyramids. Let that sit for a moment. And within those 3,000 years, the people of Egypt built a society unlike anything else the ancient world had ever seen. Not just because of the monuments, although yes, those too, but because of the extraordinary, intricate, deeply human way they organized everyday life. They had a legal system. They had labor agreements. They had love poems. They had doctors. They had games. They had divorce laws, inheritance laws, property rights. They had strikes. They had gossip. They had neighborhood disputes that dragged on for over a decade. They were, in every way that matters, people. People with hopes and anxieties and favorite foods and difficult bosses and beloved children and creaky knees and a terror of certain kinds of snakes. And the civilization they built, the one we spend our whole lives marveling at, was not built by the pharaoh alone. It was built by the woman who baked bread at 5 in the morning, by the scribe who copied the same words 10,000 times so that knowledge would survive, by the craftsman who pressed color into stone walls in a tomb no living person would ever see again. They are why we are here tonight. Now, the rooftop again, the city beginning to wake. Egypt in its height, the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the period we'll spend much of our time in tonight, is a civilization of somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. Most of them, the great majority, live in small villages along the Nile. Mud brick houses, small fields, goats and cattle, a local temple, a local official who comes once a year to measure the floodline and calculate the taxes. But the cities are extraordinary. Thebes, which the Egyptians called Waset, the city we know today as Luxor, is the heart of the new kingdom. It sits on both banks of the Nile, the eastern bank alive with temples and markets and houses packed tightly together, the western bank shadowed and sacred, home to the necropolis, the Valley of the Kings, and the village we will visit later in this story, a place called Setmat, the place of truth. Memphis to the north is older and different in texture, more administrative, more commercial, sitting at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, where the Nile begins to fan into its delta, and Alexandria, centuries later, would become the great jewel of the Mediterranean. But tonight we are in the warm south, in Thebes, in the time of Rameses and his many successors, in a city where the god Amun rules and the priests who serve him grow powerful enough to challenge kings. And in this city right now, as the copper sky brightens to gold and gold shifts slowly toward blue, someone is waking up. Her name for our purposes is Nefertari, not the queen. There was a famous Queen Nefertari, wife of Rameses II, whose tomb is one of the most beautiful things ever created by human hands. This Nefertari is a different woman entirely, a baker's wife. She lives in the eastern part of Thebes, in a neighborhood of craftsmen and small merchants, in a house that is, by the standards of the ancient world, perfectly comfortable, and by our standards, strikingly, almost shockingly simple. She wakes before sunrise. She wakes because there is bread to make, and bread in ancient Egypt is not a simple thing. It is everything. It is currency. It is sustenance. It is the single most important object in Egyptian daily life. And Nefertari has been making it since she was old enough to kneel beside her mother and learn the rhythm of grinding grain. She rises from a sleeping mat on the floor of the back room. The room is small, the walls are plastered and painted with a simple ochre wash, not elaborate, not decorated with gods, just clean and warm-colored. In one corner, a small wooden chest holds the family's good linen. A clay oil lamp, cold now, sits on a ledge. Near the doorway, a clay figure of the household god Bes, a short, fierce, leonine deity who protects homes and children, stands watch. Nefertari moves quietly past her husband, who is still asleep, past the sleeping shape of her eldest daughter, into the front room of the house, where the grain is stored in large clay jars, sealed with linen and clay stoppers to keep out insects. She unstoppers one. The smell of it, emmer wheat, slightly nutty, dry and clean, is the smell of morning in ancient Egypt. Let's pause here for a moment to understand what she is about to do, because it reveals something important about everyday life in Egypt that most history books gloss over. There was no money in ancient Egypt, not in any form we would recognize. No coins, no currency, no price tags. Egypt ran on a barter system, a redistribution economy, as historians call it, in which goods and labor were exchanged directly. The state collected grain as taxes and redistributed it as wages. Workers were paid in bread, beer, oil, linen, fish. A doctor might receive a sandal maker's work in exchange for a remedy. A craftsman building a neighbor's roof might be paid in jars of oil and a bolt of cloth. And at the center of all of it was grain. Grain was wheat and barley, and wheat became bread and barley became beer, and together they were the foundation of the entire Egyptian economy. The workers who built the great pyramids at Giza were paid partly in beer, 3 rations a day. The craftsmen at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village we will visit later tonight, received precisely 300 liters of wheat and 110 liters of barley every single month as their wage. The foreman and the scribe received more, 420 liters of wheat and 150 liters of barley, acknowledging their higher rank. These numbers come from actual records. Actual papyrus and limestone chips covered with calculations by actual Egyptian scribes, preserved for 3,000 years, discovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century. We know exactly what an Egyptian worker earned because they wrote it down and it survived. And so when Nefertari opens that jar of grain, she is holding in her hands what amounts to her family's paycheck. Her husband, a baker employed at a local temple bakery, receives his grain rations from the temple's storehouses. Some of it goes directly into bread for sale or exchange. Some of it is ground at home. All of it matters enormously. She pours the grain onto the grinding stone, a flat, heavy stone called a saddle quern, and kneels beside it, taking a smaller stone in both hands. She begins to grind, back and forth, back and forth. The sound is low and rhythmic like a slow wave. It will take her the better part of an hour to grind enough flour for the family's daily bread. Her knees rest on the hard floor. Her arms ache in that familiar, accepted way. Outside, other sounds are beginning. A baby crying 2 houses down, a goat making its complaint, a man's voice raised briefly in morning prayer. The city is waking up. But what did Egyptian houses look like? They looked, to be honest, much like the houses you might still find in rural parts of the Middle East or North Africa today. And this is not a coincidence, because the logic of building in a hot, dry climate with limited materials doesn't change much over millennia. The walls were made of mud bricks, sun-dried, not fired, which is why almost none of them have survived. Unlike stone, mud brick eventually dissolves back into the earth it came from. We know what the houses looked like, primarily because of tomb paintings that showed interior scenes, and because of a small number of sites, most notably Deir el-Medina, where the stone foundations have been preserved in the dry desert air. A typical home of a craftsman or mid-level worker had 4 rooms. The first room, the front room nearest the street, served as a kind of reception and work area. This is where guests might be received, where small transactions might happen, where tools were kept. In wealthier homes, this room was sometimes raised slightly on a platform, with a small column or two. The second room was the main living area. This is where the family spent most of their time indoors, where meals were eaten, where children played, where the adults talked and gossiped and argued. The ceiling here was sometimes higher, allowing for better ventilation. A small window, set high in the wall to keep out direct sunlight, let in air, and a narrow stripe of light. The third room was for sleeping. The mat on the floor was common for most people, though wooden beds did exist for those who could afford them. We have found them in tombs, simple and elegant, with woven cord surfaces and a carved wooden headrest replacing a pillow. And the fourth room was the kitchen, though the word kitchen is generous. It was a small, hot, smoky space where a clay oven sat, fueled by dried animal dung and brushwood. The smoke had to go somewhere, and it went mainly up through holes in the roof and out through cracks in the walls, leaving the ceilings of Egyptian kitchens perpetually black and oily. Above all of this, the rooftop. The flat roof was as important as any room below. It was where the family slept on hot summer nights, when the interior of the house became an oven. It was where grain and fish were dried and stored. It was where women worked during the cooler morning hours, grinding grain or weaving linen on small hand looms. It was, in the warm Egyptian evenings, a kind of living room in the sky, where families gathered to talk as the first stars appeared. The flour is ready. Nefertari adds water, stored in a large clay jar that a water carrier replenished yesterday afternoon, and a small amount of old dough that she has saved from the day before. This saved dough acts as a leavening agent, a way of giving the bread some rise without needing to understand anything about yeast or bacteria. The Egyptians didn't know why it worked, they only knew that it did, and that had been enough for 3,000 years. She needs. Egyptian bread dough is stiff and dense. It requires real effort. Her hands are strong, A baker's wife develops strong hands early, and she works the dough until it is smooth and elastic, pressing the heel of her hand into it, folding it, pressing again. There is something about this moment, this ordinary morning moment, that deserves a pause. Because right now, in this small house in ancient Thebes, this woman is doing something that women in Egypt had been doing for 1,000 years before her birth, and would continue doing for 1,000 years after her death. The saddle quern under her knees is a design so ancient and so effective that it barely changed over 3 millennia. The sourdough technique she uses, saving old dough to leaven the new, is essentially the same technique used by artisan bakers today. The smell of bread beginning to warm in a clay oven is a smell that connects every human civilization that ever existed on this planet. She is not remarkable. She would not appear in any inscription, any relief, any official record. And yet here she is, at the absolute foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, doing the thing that makes all of it possible, feeding people. By the time the bread is in the oven, the sun has cleared the eastern horizon. The streets below are alive now. In ancient Egypt, the working day began early, very early by our standards. The brutal midday heat made afternoon work nearly impossible, so most labor was conducted in the morning hours, from sunrise until roughly noon, at which point people retreated into their homes to rest during the hottest part of the day. Work might resume in the late afternoon, but the real effort happened in those precious, cool morning hours. Walking through a street in ancient Thebes in the early morning is an experience of extraordinary density and noise. The houses lean close together. The streets are narrow, some barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The ground underfoot is packed earth and occasional stone. There are no sidewalks, no gutters, no system for dealing with waste, which means that the streets of Egyptian cities were not, by our standards, clean. Refuse was thrown into the street. Animals wandered freely. The smell of a large city without modern sanitation is something we have almost completely lost the ability to imagine, though the archaeological record gives us hints. And yet, there is beauty here too. On a wealthier street, the whitewashed walls of a large house glow in the early light. Over the wall, you can see the tops of date palms and the feathery fronds of a small garden. A trained monkey sits on a rooftop, watching the street below with enormous amber eyes. Somewhere nearby, a pool of water, the Egyptians loved their garden pools, reflects the color of the sky. Children are everywhere. Egyptian families were large by necessity. Infant mortality was devastating. Perhaps 1 in 3 children did not survive their first year, and so families had many children hoping some would live. The children who did survive often worked from a young age, not in a way we would consider sinister, but integrated into the rhythms of daily life. Small children helped carry things, fetched water, watched younger siblings, helped with animals. As they grew, they learned their parents' trades. Education, such as it was a privilege of class. For the vast majority of Egyptians, the farmers, the laborers, the craftspeople, formal schooling did not exist. Skills were passed from parent to child, from master to apprentice. A carpenter's son learned to work wood by working beside his father. A weaver's daughter learned at the loom before she could reach it without standing on a stone. The only formal schooling available was for those destined to become scribes, and that path was narrow, selective, and life-changing. But we'll get to the scribes. For now, the baker is leaving his house. Nefertari's husband, let's call him Ka, a common Egyptian name, steps out into the morning street, still eating the last of the bread his wife placed in his hands as he left. He is a man of perhaps 35, which in ancient Egypt is middle age in every real sense. He has the kind of body that comes from physical labor, strong hands and forearms, a slight curve in the lower back from years of standing over a mixing trough, a face that is darker from the sun on the lower half than the upper, where a linen headcloth has offered some shade. He works at the temple bakery, not the great temple of Karnak. That is something else entirely, a monumental complex of extraordinary scale, staffed by hundreds of priests and officials and servants. Ka works at a smaller local temple, one of the dozens of neighborhood shrines and religious institutions that dot the city. The bakery attached to this temple produces bread for two purposes: for the daily offerings placed before the god's statue inside the temple, and for distribution as wages to the temple workers, priests, and staff. The work is hot and relentless. The temple bakery is a large, low-ceilinged room, its floor blackened with decades of spilled flour and ash. Along one wall, a row of clay ovens radiates heat even before they are stoked to full temperature. The mixing troughs, large, shallow basins of stone and plastered mud, stand in a row down the center of the room. Several workers are already there when Ka arrives, and the work begins immediately. Some mix dough in the troughs, kneading it with their hands, their forearms plunged to the elbow in the thick, resistant mass. Others shape the dough into loaves. Egyptian bread came in an astonishing variety of shapes, from simple flat rounds to elaborate cones, pyramids, and even figurative loaves shaped like animals or human beings for religious offerings. At least 40 different types of bread have been identified in ancient Egyptian records. 40. For a civilization we sometimes imagine as simple and static. And one of the oldest historical sources we have notes something that would probably stop most of us mid-bite. Ancient Egyptian bakers sometimes kneaded bread with their feet. Not always, not as a rule, but in larger batches. When the dough was too stiff and too voluminous to be worked by hand, workers stepped into the mixing troughs and kneaded it with their feet, a fact that ancient Egyptian paintings record quite matter-of-factly, without apology or embarrassment. It was simply the most efficient way to do the job. The bread that emerged from these ovens was good, by the standards of the time. But there was a problem. A serious, painful, inescapable problem that afflicted nearly every Egyptian who ate it regularly. The grinding stones. When grain was ground on a saddle quern, tiny particles of stone, sand and grit from the quern itself, fragments of the millstone worn away by the grinding, contaminated the flour. This was invisible. There was no way to remove it, no way to filter it out. And so every loaf of Egyptian bread, from the humblest to the most refined, contained a fine, abrasive grit that, eaten day after day, year after year, ground down the enamel of the teeth. Archaeologists who have examined Egyptian mummies and skeletons have found this damage consistently across all social classes: pharaohs, priests, workers, farmers. Almost everyone who ate the local bread showed significant dental wear by middle age. Tooth decay and dental abscesses were common. Toothache was one of the most frequent complaints recorded in Egyptian medical papyri. The food that sustained them was also, slowly and silently, destroying their teeth. This is the kind of detail that makes ancient history suddenly, strikingly real. The sun is up now, fully up, pouring golden light into the narrow streets. The city is in full motion. Let's walk a little. Let's see. The market district in an Egyptian city is not a market in the way we might picture one. No permanent stalls, no currency, no fixed prices. It is more fluid than that. People gather near the river, near the temple gates, in open spaces between buildings, and they trade. They lay out their goods on mats or in baskets or simply hold them in their arms. Bunches of leeks and onions, dried fish wrapped in palm leaves, small clay pots of oil, wooden sandals, linen cloth, amulets and small figurines of painted clay. Everything is negotiated. You want a basket of onions? What do you have? A handful of copper rings, which do exist and serve as a rough unit of value. A length of linen, some dried fish, a small alabaster jar. The value of everything is known, roughly by custom and habit. An ox is worth a certain number of copper daben, a measurement of weight used as a reference. A tunic is worth a certain number of loaves. A good sandal is worth a specific amount of oil. There are no receipts, but there are, in some cases, witnesses. For important transactions, the sale of a house, the agreement to a large labor deal, a scribe might be brought in to record the transaction on a piece of papyrus, or more commonly, on an ostrakon, a chip of limestone or a pottery shard, which served as the everyday writing material of ancient Egypt in the same way a notebook serves us today. Ostraka, plural, everywhere. The Egyptians wrote on everything. Limestone chips were free, abundant, already white and smooth from the quarrying process, perfect for notes and records and shopping lists and letters. We have found thousands of them, tens of thousands. From the workers' village at Deir el-Medina alone, archaeologists have recovered more than 5,000 ostraka covered in writing, giving us a window into ordinary Egyptian life of extraordinary intimacy. Lists of tools, accounts of grain delivered, records of days worked and days missed, love notes, complaints about neighbors, a man writing to his dead wife asking her to stop haunting his dreams, a worker noting, with the casual specificity of someone writing a quick text message, that he was absent from work that day because he was drunk. The ancient Egyptians were, in every possible sense, human. We have been walking for a while now. The sun is getting higher. The air is warming. Time to slow down. Let the sounds of the city fade a little. The hawking of the fish sellers, the clang of the coppersmith, the shrill argument between two women over the ownership of a large clay jar. Let them soften, become background, like the sound of a river heard from a distance. Settle into this world. Feel the warm stone underfoot, the dry air on your skin, the smell of the Nile, that particular ancient smell, green and muddy and alive, carrying 1,000 miles of Africa on it, drifting over the rooftops. This is a world that lasted 3,000 years, 3,000 years of ordinary mornings, 3,000 years of bread in the oven, and children running in the street, and old men sitting in the shade, and women at the grinding stone, and scribes crouching over their records, and farmers watching the sky. 3,000 years, and we are only just beginning. In the chapters ahead, we will follow the Nile through the flood season and watch what it means for everyone who depends on it. We will sit in the school of a scribe and feel the weight of the reed pen in our hand. We will walk into the workers' village, the place of truth, and meet the men and women who spent their lives carving and painting in tombs so perfect that we still weep at them today. We will sit in an Egyptian court of law and watch ordinary people argue over ordinary things. We will follow a woman through the rules and freedoms of a society that gave her rights most of her contemporaries in Greece and Rome could barely imagine. But for now, for right now, let the city hum around you. Let the bread bake. Let the light come in through the high window, that single stripe of gold across the plaster wall. Let Egypt be ordinary. Because that, in the end, is the most extraordinary thing about it. There is a smell that every person in ancient Egypt knew. Every child who ever ran barefoot through a village street. Every old man sitting in the shade of a sycamore fig tree. Every worker carrying stone under the white blaze of a summer sky. They all knew this smell intimately, viscerally, the way we know the smell of rain on hot pavement, or coffee in the morning, or the particular sweetness of a house where someone bakes bread. It was the smell of the Nile in flood, not the clean, somewhat romantic image of a great river that we might conjure from a distance. The real smell, muddy and ancient and alive, thick with silt, carried all the way from the highlands of Ethiopia, carrying the faint scent of decomposing vegetation from 1,000 miles upstream, mixed with the mineral sharpness of churned river bottom and the unmistakable organic warmth of water that has passed through the hearts of half a continent. To us, that smell might seem overwhelming. To an ancient Egyptian farmer standing on the bank of the Nile in late July, watching the water begin to rise, that smell was the smell of life itself. It was the smell of next year's food. Let's go to the river. It is July and something is happening. All across Egypt, from the southernmost reaches of the country near Aswan, where enormous granite boulders break the surface of the river like the backs of sleeping giants, all the way north to the broad fan of the delta, where the Nile spreads itself across the land in a dozen braided channels before meeting the Mediterranean, all across this thin green ribbon of civilization in the middle of a vast desert. The water is rising. It began weeks ago, barely noticeable at first, the river a few inches higher on the stone steps that lead down to the water, the color shifting from clear to a faint greenish brown. Then more still. Until now, in the peak of summer, the Nile is swelling with a power and a slowness that is almost majestic, spreading out across the floodplain with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years. And it has. The flooding of the Nile, what the ancient Egyptians called the Akhet, the season of inundation, was the single most important natural event in the entire Egyptian year, more important than any battle, any coronation, any religious festival. Because without it there was no food. Without it there was no Egypt. Here is what happened, and why. Far to the south of Egypt, in the mountains of Ethiopia, the summer monsoon rains fall in almost incomprehensible quantities. The Blue Nile, which begins its journey at Lake Tana, high in those mountains, swells with rainwater and carries it northward, gathering speed and volume as it descends toward the lowlands. This surge of water reaches Egypt in July, peaks in August, and begins to slowly recede in October. At the height of the flood, the water could be nearly 5 meters above its normal dry season level. Fields that had been cracked and pale with heat were now under several feet of dark, silty water. And that silt, that rich black mud carried all the way from the Ethiopian highlands, was everything. The ancient Egyptians had a word for their own land, Kemet, the Black Land. It was not called the Black Land because of anything mysterious or symbolic. It was called the Black Land because of the color of the soil that the Nile left behind when it flooded and retreated. Black, fertile, almost impossibly rich soil, deposited fresh every single year, automatically, without anyone having to do anything at all. No fertilizer, no crop rotation, no leaving fields fallow. The river simply renewed the land on its own. The contrast with what lay beyond that narrow strip of black soil was total and absolute. The Egyptians called it the Deshret, the Red Land, the desert. A few meters beyond the reach of the flood, where the black soil ended and the sand and gravel of the Sahara began, almost nothing grew. The line between green life and red death was, and still is, along parts of the Nile, so sharp you could stand with one foot in a field of wheat and the other in sand. The river was not just important to Egypt, the river was Egypt. Now the farmers. If Nefertari and Ka represent the craft working class of ancient Egypt, the urban residents, the temple employees, then we need to look further, out into the fields, at the people who made everything else possible. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians were farmers. Estimates vary, but most historians believe that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the population were engaged in agriculture at least part of the year. This was not a society with a large middle class of merchants and professionals. It was a society balanced on the very wide base of agricultural labor, with everything else, the scribes, the priests, the soldiers, the craftsmen, the officials, perched on top of that foundation. Let's meet one of them. His name is Neb-wen-Nef, Neb for short, and he lives in a small village about half a day's walk from Thebes, on the west bank of the Nile. He is a man of perhaps 40, though he looks older. His skin is deeply weathered, darkened and creased by decades of outdoor labor under the Egyptian sun. His hands are the hands of a man who has spent his life working with soil and water and rope and stone. Rough, strong, permanently stained at the knuckles with a faint trace of earth that no amount of washing entirely removes. Neb does not own his land. Almost no Egyptian farmer owned their land outright. The land of Egypt, in the official theology and in practical administrative reality, belonged to the pharaoh, who was not merely a king, but a living god, the intermediary between the human world and the divine one, the sole owner of everything in the kingdom. Farmers like Neb worked land that was allocated to them by local officials, and in return paid taxes, in grain, in labor, in livestock. This sounds oppressive by modern standards, and in many ways it was. But it was also, within its context, a functioning system of mutual obligation. The state took a significant portion of the harvest. In return, the state maintained the irrigation network, managed the grain reserves, organized large-scale labor projects, and, crucially, fed people when the flood failed and the harvest was poor. The system could be brutal. It could also, in good years, be workable. It depended enormously on the flood. Right now, in late July, Neb is standing on the bank above his fields, or rather, where his fields used to be. They are underwater. The water came slowly, as it always does, creeping across the low ground, filling the irrigation basins, rising up the levees that Neb and his neighbors spent the early part of the summer repairing and reinforcing. Now the entire floodplain is a shallow lake, brown with silt, reflecting the pale sky in its stillness. Date palms stand with their bases submerged. The path between Neb's village and the next is no longer a path, but a raised causeway, with water on either side, and even this is beginning to flood at its lowest point. Neb is not worried, not yet, because this exact level of flooding is what he needed, what everyone needed. Not too low, not too high, just right. The Egyptians knew this math with terrifying precision because their lives depended on it. They had developed instruments called nilometers, calibrated measuring devices cut into rock or built into stone columns at strategic points along the river, to measure the height of the flood and predict the harvest months in advance. We have records of the readings from some of these nilometers going back more than 1,000 years. The readings were not just numbers. They were prophecy. If the flood rose to 13 cubits, each cubit roughly 18 inches, the length of a forearm, there would be famine. Not enough water to saturate the fields. Not enough silt deposited. The harvest would fail. 14 cubits, sufficiency. Barely enough. People would eat, but tightly. 15 cubits, satisfaction. A decent year. 16 cubits, happiness. A good year, surpluses, full granaries. 17 cubits, abundance. A great year, perhaps the best. But 18 cubits, 19, disaster of a different kind. Too much water, and the flood would destroy the villages and the levees, sweep away the carefully maintained canal networks, drown the livestock, ruin the grain stores. A flood too large was almost as catastrophic as a flood too small. What the Egyptians needed, every year without fail, was a flood that was exactly right. And for most of their 3,000-year history, they got it. The Nile was unusually, almost miraculously reliable by the standards of ancient rivers. Other great rivers of the ancient world, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus, the Yellow River in China, flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. The Nile flooded on a schedule so consistent that the Egyptians could set their calendar by it. They did set their calendar by it. The Egyptian New Year began with the first sign of the flood, heralded by the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which appeared on the horizon just before dawn at exactly the same time the waters began to rise. To an Egyptian farmer, the sight of Sirius rising in the pre-dawn sky was not an astronomical curiosity. It was a promise. The river was coming. The year was beginning. Life was continuing. But sometimes the promise was broken. Sometimes the flood was too low. Sometimes it didn't come at all. We know from ancient records, from administrative documents, from inscriptions on temple walls, from papyri preserved in the dry desert air, that Egypt experienced crop failures, famines, and years of desperate hunger. The centralized grain storage system, maintained by the state in enormous granaries in the major cities, was designed precisely for these moments. In good years, the state stored the surplus. In bad years, it distributed the reserves. The system worked most of the time, but it could not fix everything. There is a papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III, dating to around 1150 BCE, that records something extraordinary. It is a record of a labor strike, possibly the first recorded labor strike in all of human history. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the craftsmen who were carving and painting the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, had not received their grain rations for weeks. The state, for whatever reason, administrative failure, poor harvest, corruption, had simply stopped delivering the grain that the workers' families depended on to eat, and so they stopped working. They walked out of the site, sat down at the gatehouse of a nearby mortuary temple, and refused to move until they were paid. Their words, recorded on a papyrus that survived 3,000 years, are startling in their directness. "We are hungry," they said. 18 days have already passed this month, and we have not been given our rations." 18 days without food. They sat there. They waited. Eventually, some rations were produced, though not in full, and they returned to work. And then, in subsequent months, it happened again and again. The records of Deir el-Medina from this period show a pattern of late and irregular rations, of workers absenting themselves in protest, of foremen writing increasingly urgent letters to administrators, trying to get the grain flowing again. The great monuments of Egypt were built by people who had employment contracts, who could go on strike, who had food shortages, who wrote angry letters to their bosses. They were workers, in every sense of the word. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. It is still July. The flood is at its perfect height. And Neb, standing on the bank above his submerged fields, is making calculations. The water will begin to recede in October. When it does, it will leave behind, across the entire floodplain, in a layer that might be millimeters thin or several centimeters deep, depending on the current, a coating of that precious black silt. And then begins the planting season, the parade, the season of emergence. The timing is everything. Plant too early, while the ground is still too wet and the seeds rot. Plant too late, and the growing season is cut short by the heat. The ideal planting window after the flood recedes is narrow, and Neb knows it from decades of experience, from watching the soil, feeling it, the way a baker knows when dough is ready to bake, not from a recipe, but from the touch of his hands. In October and November, the fields come alive with labor. This is the most intense period of agricultural work in the Egyptian year. Every able-bodied person works. Men drive ox plows through the heavy, still damp soil, cutting the dark earth into neat furrows. Women and older children follow behind, sowing seed by hand, pressing it into the soil, sometimes driving animals across the planted rows to tamp the seeds deeper. The work goes from sunrise to the midday break and resumes in the late afternoon, day after day, until the planting is done. The crops planted are primarily emmer wheat and barley, the bread and beer of civilization in their raw material form, but also flax, which will be retted and spun into linen, chickpeas, lentils, garlic, onions, leeks, vegetables that supplement the grain-based diet. Papyrus, cultivated in the marshy edges of the floodplain and the delta, which will become writing material, and also rope, baskets, sandals, and boat hulls. Then begins the long waiting. The Pere season stretches from October to March. For a few months after planting, there is less to do, some irrigation work, maintaining the canals, watching the crops grow. This is when other labor calls, repairing houses, building community projects, being conscripted for state work. And then in March and April, the harvest, the shemu, the hot season. Harvest in ancient Egypt was a community event of massive scale. The grain was cut with wooden-handled sickles tipped with flint or copper blades, the workers moving through the fields in long lines, swinging the sickles in a steady rhythm that, when 100 workers moved together across a large field, created a sound like dry, whispered waves. Children followed behind to gather the fallen stalks. Women tied the grain into bundles. The bundles were loaded onto donkeys or onto human backs and carried to the threshing floor. At the threshing floor, a hardened, circular area of packed earth at the edge of the field, the grain stalks were spread out and animals were driven back and forth over them, their hooves breaking the husks and separating the grain from the straw. Then the winnowing. Workers tossed the broken grain into the air with wooden scoops, letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back to the floor. Then sieving, cleaning, sorting, and then the weighing. Because at every threshing floor, the tax collector was waiting. The state's claim on the harvest was administered by scribes and officials who appeared at harvest time to measure the yield and calculate what was owed. They had measuring vessels, standards, official weights. They recorded everything on their papyri and limestone chips. The farmer's portion was what remained after the state's share was removed, and that share could be substantial, though the exact percentage varied enormously by period, location, and circumstance. If the harvest was poor, this was the moment of crisis. If a farmer could not pay his taxes in grain, the state had other options. There are records, not common but not rare either, of farmers who fell into debt to the state, who had tools or livestock seized, who were conscripted into labor gangs as a way of working off what they owed. The system was not kind to failure, but in a good year, and most years were good years because the Nile was reliable, the farmer who had worked through 3 seasons, who had repaired his levees and sowed his fields and sweated through the harvest, that farmer would see his family fed through the year, would exchange his surplus for other goods in the local market, would perhaps save enough to buy a goat or a new tool or a length of good linen for his wife. A modest life. A hard life, a life that held the whole civilization up. Now, back to town, back to the smell of bread. Because we cannot talk about ancient Egypt and food without talking about the other thing. The thing that was, if anything, even more central to daily life than bread. The beer, ancient Egyptian beer. Let's clear something up immediately, because what most people imagine when they hear ancient Egyptian beer is something grim and foul, a thick, bitter, barely drinkable gruel consumed out of necessity because there was nothing better available. That is not what it was, at all. The ancient Egyptians, by virtually every account we have, including the testimony of ancient Greek writers who were not exactly fans of beer as a concept, were extraordinarily skilled brewers. They had been brewing for longer than any civilization on Earth except possibly the Sumerians. Their beer had been refined over millennia. They had dozens of varieties. They had named their beers Friend's Beer, Iron Beer, Beer of the Protector, the way we name wines or craft ales today. And the beer they produced was, at its core, something that would actually taste recognizable to a modern craft beer drinker. Not identical, not even close in some ways, but recognizable. Here is roughly how it was made. Emmer wheat or barley was partially germinated, allowed to sprout, and then dried. This process, called malting, activates the enzymes that will later convert the grain's starches into fermentable sugars. The malted grain was then ground into a coarse flour. Some of this flour was baked into a partially cooked bread, hot enough to kill bacteria, but not hot enough to destroy the enzymes. The rest was made into a cold mash with water. The two were then combined, the hot-baked bread and the cold water mash, and this combination allowed the enzymes to do their work, converting starches to sugars as the mixture cooled. The resulting liquid was filtered through a cloth or a basket to remove the solid grain matter, poured into large clay fermentation vessels, and left to ferment for 2 to 3 days. The natural wild yeasts present in the grain, in the clay vessels, in the Egyptian air, did the rest. What emerged was a cloudy, somewhat thick, mildly alcoholic liquid, probably between 2 and 4% alcohol, significantly weaker than modern beers, with a slightly sour, slightly sweet, slightly yeasty flavor. It was nutritious. It was caloric. It was safer to drink than the Nile water because the fermentation process killed many of the bacteria that could cause disease. And it was, apparently, genuinely good. Archaeologists who have recreated ancient Egyptian beer from the residue found in excavated brewing vessels, actual 5,000-year-old yeast strains, actual ancient grain varieties, have been consistently surprised by the result. Not appalling, not medicinal, actually pleasant, rich, slightly fruity, with a complexity that reflects the grain and the wild fermentation. The British Museum recreated a batch in 2019 using ingredients and techniques drawn from archaeological evidence. The tasters, expecting something unpleasant, found it delicious. 3,000 years later, still good. Now, here is the thing about Egyptian beer that is not just interesting but actually radical when you think about it carefully. Egyptian beer was not an indulgence. It was not a luxury. It was not even primarily a social drink in the way we think of it today. Something consumed at the end of a long day to relax, a treat, a reward. Egyptian beer was food. It was food in the same category as bread, caloric, nutritious, essential. Workers at Giza received their daily rations in bread and beer, and those rations were calculated to keep them alive and functional through extremely demanding physical labor. The beer contributed significant calories. Some estimates suggest up to 1,200 calories per gallon, along with B vitamins, protein, and minerals from the grain. For people whose diet was otherwise heavily reliant on bread with relatively little meat or fat, the beer filled real nutritional gaps, and everyone drank it. Everyone. Not just men, not just adults, not just workers. Women drank it, children drank a weaker version of it. Priests drank it as part of religious rituals. The pharaoh was buried with it in his tomb for use in the afterlife. Patients were prescribed it by doctors in over 100 different medical treatments. The beer was so fundamental to Egyptian life that the hieroglyphic sign for meal was a drawing of a loaf of bread and a jar of beer side by side. Bread and beer. Beer and bread. Two sides of the same grain. The workers at Deir el-Medina, those craftsmen whose records we have in such extraordinary detail, received as part of their standard monthly rations a precise allocation that included both. And when those rations were late, when the beer jars stopped arriving, that was when they walked off the job. It was not beer they were striking over, it was their food. There is something deeply human about all of this. Stand in an ancient Egyptian field at harvest time, and everything is loud and hot and overwhelming. The dust from the threshing, the shouts of the workers, the creak of the ox carts, the weight of the bundles on your back. But sit down in the afternoon shade of an acacia tree, pass around the communal beer jar with its long reed straws. Because you drink Egyptian beer through a straw to strain out the grain residue still floating in it. And suddenly, everything is quiet and comfortable and comprehensible, multiple people sipping from the same jar. The same image that appears in tomb paintings, in limestone reliefs, in the records of parties and festivals and ordinary evenings in the workers' village. People sitting together, sharing a drink. The technology was different. The world around them was almost unimaginably different. But the moment of putting down the day's work and sitting together and drinking something that made you feel warm and a little slow and entirely human, that moment is the same. It has always been the same. Let's talk about what else they ate. Because bread and beer, central as they were not the entirety of the Egyptian diet. They were the foundation, the bottom of the pyramid, but there was more, layered on top of it. The Nile provided fish in extraordinary abundance, perch, catfish, mullet, tilapia. The river teemed with fish, and Egyptians of all classes ate them. Fish was one of the most common proteins in the diet, available fresh during most of the year, dried and salted for storage. Fishermen worked the river every day in small papyrus reed boats, using nets, lines, and traps. The dried fish, split, salted and laid out to dry in the sun on racks above the riverbank, was part of the ration issued to workers along with their grain. Vegetables were important and varied. Onions and garlic were ubiquitous, cheap, easy to grow, full of flavor and nutrients, and believed to have medicinal properties. There is a famous ancient account suggesting that inscriptions in the Great Pyramid record the quantities of radishes, onions and garlic consumed by the pyramid workers. Whether or not that specific claim holds up, it captures something real about the centrality of these vegetables to the workers' diet. Lettuce, cucumber, leeks, and various legumes rounded out the vegetable garden. Fruit was seasonal and treasured. Dates from the date palms that grew everywhere along the Nile were sweet, calorie-dense, and could be dried for long storage. Figs and dom palm nuts were also eaten. Grapes were cultivated in the Delta and Oasis regions, and from them came wine. But wine was an elite drink, expensive, associated with the upper classes, with priests and officials and the wealthy. The ordinary Egyptian drank beer, not wine. Meat was complicated. For the wealthiest Egyptians, officials, priests, nobles, meat was available and important. Cattle, goats, sheep, geese, ducks, pigeons. There are tomb paintings of elaborate butchery scenes, of whole oxen being prepared for feasts, of offerings of meat piled before the gods and the deceased. For the ordinary farmer or craftsman, meat was more occasional. Not absent, but not daily. Special occasions, religious festivals when the temple distributed food to the people, weddings, funerals, the celebration of a good harvest. On those days, the smell of roasting meat mixed with the bread and the beer, and the meal became something festive, something worth remembering. The rest of the time, people made do with fish, vegetables, bread and beer, and generally seemed to thrive on it. Egyptian skeletons from this period, while showing the expected signs of hard physical labor, the worn joints, the healed injuries, the ground-down teeth, also show a population that was reasonably well-nourished. No widespread signs of severe vitamin deficiency, no mass malnutrition in the archaeological record. The food system worked, not elegantly, not equally, but it worked. One more thing before we leave this chapter and let the river settle back into its banks. There is a word that describes the Egyptian relationship with the Nile and the land and the flood, and that word is not gratitude and it is not reverence, though both of those are part of it. The word, if we need one, is something closer to intimacy. The ancient Egyptians did not experience the natural world as something separate from themselves, something to be studied from a distance or controlled through technology. They lived inside it, woven into it, their daily rhythms and annual cycles and religious beliefs and emotional lives all structured around the behavior of one river. They named it simply the river. Not the Nile, that name came from the Greeks, just the river. as if there were only one, as if no other water existed worth naming, and in the world they lived in, perhaps that was close to true. The river gave them the black soil that fed them. The river gave them the fish that supplemented their diet. The river gave them the papyrus that they wrote on, the clay that they built with, the mud that they shaped into bricks and pottery. The river was the highway on which their boats traveled, the road that connected the far south to the delta in the north. The river was the boundary between their world and the desert, between life and death. When the flood came, they called it the tears of Isis, the great goddess of love and magic, mourning her murdered husband Osiris. They planted mud figures of Osiris with barley seeds and watched them sprout as a symbol of resurrection. They made offerings at the water's edge. They threw flowers into the current. And then they rolled up their linen, waded into the receding flood, and started checking the silt deposits on their fields. Because beautiful as the theology was, the crops still needed planting. The gods demanded reverence. The family demanded dinner. And in ancient Egypt, as everywhere, the family came first. The afternoon is long and warm. The flood has reached its peak and is just beginning, to ease back. The fields on the far bank are still underwater, but the levees hold, and the canal network that took years of communal labor to build and maintain is directing the water exactly where it needs to go. Neb walks back toward his village along the raised path, his feet dusty, his work for the day done. In his house, his wife is finishing a batch of beer. The fermentation jars are sealed with linen and a daubing of clay, and they will sit for another day before they are ready. Already you can smell the faint sourness of active fermentation, yeast working, sugars converting, the miracle of biology that no one in ancient Egypt understood mechanistically, but everyone understood practically. Leave the grain water in the jar, and something happens to it that makes it wonderful. His daughter brings him a cup of water, cold from the storage jar, which sweats slightly in the dry air, keeping its contents cool through evaporation. He sits on the step outside his front door and drinks it. The street is quieter now, in the afternoon heat. A cat, ancient Egypt, had plenty of cats, beloved and sometimes sacred, picks its way along the top of the opposite wall with the deliberate care of a creature that has never in its life done anything carelessly. Two boys at the end of the street are arguing about something in the cheerful, escalating way of boys who are not really angry yet and might not get there. The smell of the Nile is everywhere. It is the smell of next year's bread. It is the smell of the beer that is fermenting in the jar. It is the smell of everything that holds this whole improbable civilization together. Settle into it. Let it wash over you. There is more to come. There is a question that every person who has ever stood before the Great Pyramid of Giza has asked, maybe not out loud, maybe only in the private quietness that comes over you when you stand at the foot of something so enormous, so impossibly ancient, so stubbornly, defiantly present, something that has been standing in the same spot since before the Roman Empire existed, before the Greeks wrote their first philosophy, before most of the world's religions were even imagined. The question is simply this: how? Not how in the engineering sense, though that too is extraordinary, but how in the human sense. How do you get tens of thousands of people to move millions of stone blocks, each one weighing more than a car across miles of desert, and stack them with such precision that a modern engineer would be proud of the result? How do you make that happen? For generations, the answer people reached for was the dark one, the obvious one. The one that Hollywood put on screen in vivid sunburned detail: slaves, thousands of slaves, driven by whips and starvation and fear, dragging stone across sand under a merciless sky, dying in their thousands and being replaced by thousands more. It is a compelling image. It is also almost certainly wrong. And the true story, the real story of who built the pyramids, who they were, how they lived, and why they did it, is in some ways far more interesting. Let's go back further tonight. back beyond Thebes and the New Kingdom, all the way to Giza, around 2560 BCE, the Old Kingdom, the age of the great pyramid builders. And let's meet the people who were actually there. First, the scribe. Because to understand any large-scale human enterprise in ancient Egypt, a pyramid, a temple, a military campaign, a harvest, you have to understand the scribe. Nothing happened without the scribe. Not a single brick was laid, a single ration distributed, a single worker hired or fired or fed, without a scribe recording it. The scribe was the operating system of Egyptian civilization, and becoming one was the closest thing ancient Egypt had to a golden ticket. Picture a boy. He is 6 years old, perhaps 7. He comes from a family of modest means. His father is maybe a minor temple official or a successful craftsman with some social connections. Not wealthy, but not poor. The kind of family that can afford to take a son out of the household economy for several years and invest in something less immediately useful than an extra pair of working hands. This boy is being sent to school. In ancient Egypt, the schools were called houses of instruction, and they were typically attached to temples or government buildings. The boy arrives on the first morning carrying a small wooden pallet, a flat rectangular board with 2 circular depressions carved into it, one filled with a cake of black ink made from soot mixed with gum, the other with red ink made from ground red ochre mixed with the same gum. He has a handful of reed pens, thin stems cut from the papyrus plant, the writing end chewed or pounded until it frays into a soft brush-like tip. He has a roll of linen to wipe the brushes on. He does not have papyrus. Papyrus is expensive, far too expensive for a student who will spend his first years doing nothing but making mistakes. Instead, the boy carries a small basket of limestone chips, ostraca, and a smoothed piece of wood that can be written on, wiped clean with a damp cloth, and written on again. He sits cross-legged on the floor, the way scribes sit in every painting and carving we have ever found. The wooden board across his lap, the pallet before him. And then the teacher speaks. What did they learn, these boys who would become the administrators of one of the world's greatest civilizations? They learned 2 scripts. The first was hieroglyphics, the formal pictorial writing system, the one carved into temple walls and painted into tombs, the one we immediately recognize as Egyptian writing. Hieroglyphics were beautiful, intricate, sacred. The Egyptians called them Medu Netjer, the words of the gods. They were used for religious texts, royal inscriptions, monuments, and anything that needed the weight and permanence of the divine. But hieroglyphics were also enormously time-consuming to write. Hundreds of individual signs, each one a small picture. A bird, an eye, a loaf of bread, a seated man, a coiled rope. Writing a paragraph in hieroglyphics could take hours, which is why, for everyday practical purposes, the Egyptians had developed something else entirely. Hieratic. Hieratic was the cursive form of the language, a flowing, abbreviated, much faster script in which the careful pictures of hieroglyphics had been streamlined into quick fluid marks that could be written at speed on papyrus or ostraca. Hieratic was the language of commerce, administration, letters, legal documents, and literature. It was the script that ran the country on a daily basis. And it is in hieratic, scratched on tens of thousands of limestone chips and papyri, that we find the real voices of ordinary ancient Egyptians. The boy begins to learn hieratic first. He does so by copying, endlessly, repetitively, hour after hour, day after day, copying the same words and phrases and passages until his hand knows the movements without his conscious mind having to direct them. His teacher sets him an exemplar, a correctly written passage from a standard text, and he copies it. Then his teacher examines his work, sometimes correcting errors in red ink directly on the student's work. We still have some of these corrected exercises, ostraca with a student's uncertain black marks and a teacher's red corrections alongside them. 3,000 years old, looking exactly like a homework assignment returned with annotations. The corrections could be harsh. The teaching was strict. There is an ancient Egyptian proverb about education that the teachers took as something close to gospel. The ears of a boy are on his back. He learns when he is beaten. The cane was a standard pedagogical tool. Being late, writing carelessly, producing sloppy work, all of these were punishable with physical correction. This was not unique to Egypt. It was simply the universal standard of ancient education. But the Egyptian texts are unusually frank about it. Student scribes copied out sentences like this as part of their lessons. Do not spend a day in idleness, or you will be beaten. The ear of a boy is on his back. He listens when he is struck. They were learning to write. They were also learning, by copying these sentences, exactly what would happen to them if they didn't. Training lasted, in most cases, between 5 and 10 years. The lower end of that range produced what we might call a functional scribe, someone who could write basic administrative documents, keep accounts, record transactions, write and read letters. These were the workhorse scribes of the Egyptian bureaucracy, employed at temples, in local government offices, on construction sites, in the military. The higher end produced something more formidable. A fully trained senior scribe could read and write both hieroglyphics and hieratic, could calculate complex quantities of grain and labor, could compose formal legal documents, draft diplomatic correspondence, read and understand religious texts, and navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Egyptian state. These were the men who became treasury officials, chief administrators, high priests, architects of major building projects, and, on rare occasions, something even greater. Here is a story. A man named Horemheb was born sometime around 1370 BCE to a family of modest means in a provincial town. Not nobly born, not royal. Just a family with enough standing to send their son to scribal school. He learned to write. He was competent. He was ambitious. He moved into the military as a scribe of recruits, the administrator responsible for enrolling and tracking soldiers, and proved himself not just competent, but brilliant. He rose. He kept rising. By the reign of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, yes, that Tutankhamun, Horemheb had become the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army and the deputy of the king, second only to the pharaoh himself in the official hierarchy. When Tutankhamun died young and childless, when the subsequent pharaohs proved ineffectual or short-lived, when the moment finally came, Horemheb became pharaoh of Egypt, the last king of the 18th dynasty, the man who reformed the army, restructured the judiciary, and stabilized a kingdom that had been in turmoil. He started as a boy sitting cross-legged on a floor, copying words onto a limestone chip. The scribe's palette was, in ancient Egypt, quite literally the key to the kingdom. Now, a question that every parent sending a child to scribe school must have asked themselves, because we have the evidence that they asked it. Is all this struggle actually worth it? We know they asked because we have a text, a remarkable, funny, somewhat exasperated text, called the Satire of the Trades. It was written during the Middle Kingdom, copied endlessly by student scribes as a writing exercise for centuries afterward, and it is, at its core, a father's extremely pointed argument to his son about why staying in school is worth it. The father is sending his son to scribal school by boat. Along the way he describes, in increasingly vivid and unflattering terms, every other possible career in Egypt, contrasting each of them with the comfortable life of a scribe. The soldier, says the father, marches until his feet bleed. The laundryman is elbows deep in other people's dirty clothes all day, stinking of lye. The sandal maker is perpetually bent over leather, his back wrecked, his hands permanently calloused. The weaver sits hunched at his loom until his knees lock. The farmer works in the heat and then hands most of his harvest over to the tax collector. And then the fisherman. The fisherman, says the father, stands in the water where crocodiles swim. Need we say more? The scribe, by contrast, the scribe sits in the shade. The scribe gives the orders rather than receiving them. The scribe does not carry heavy things. The scribe does not ruin his body in a decade of physical labor. The scribe is invited to good houses. The scribe is treated with respect before he has even grown his beard. It reads 4,000 years later with the unmistakable energy of a parent's speech at the beginning of a new school year. The details change. The argument is identical. Stay in school, son. But not everyone could be a scribe, and for the vast majority of young men in ancient Egypt, the ones whose families couldn't spare them from the fields, whose fathers had no connections to the temple or the palace, who grew up in villages too small to have a house of instruction, there was another path upward, one that didn't involve ink at all: the sword. The Egyptian military in the New Kingdom was a professional force of real size and sophistication. Under pharaohs like Thutmose III, who campaigned more than 17 times in the Near East and is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, and Ramesses II, whose battle at Kadesh against the Hittites is one of the most documented engagements of the ancient world, the army was a major institution, not just militarily, but socially, because the military, like the scribal profession, offered something precious in a rigidly stratified society: a way out. A young man from a farming family with nothing to his name could enlist in the army and receive, immediately, food, clothing, weapons, training, and a wage. If he survived his first campaign, he received a share of the spoils, captured goods, livestock, sometimes prisoners of war. If he distinguished himself in battle, he might receive land from the pharaoh directly. If he rose through the ranks, and the ranks were real, with specific titles and specific rewards attached to each, he could end his career as a man of property and standing, with his sons in a position to achieve what he himself could not. We know a soldier's path in some detail, because we have texts that describe it. We have letters from soldiers. We have administrative records that track promotions. We have tomb inscriptions from successful soldiers boasting of their campaigns with the cheerful pride of men who want you to know exactly what they accomplished. One such inscription belongs to a man named Ahmose, son of Ibana, a soldier who served under 3 successive pharaohs in the early New Kingdom and whose biography was carved into his tomb wall with the kind of enthusiastic specificity that makes it feel almost like reading a soldier's memoir. He lists his battles. He lists his rewards: gold, land, slaves given to him by pharaohs personally. He notes the times he was at the front, in the thick of it, close enough to enemy soldiers to fight them hand to hand and take their weapons as trophies. He is proud, and he wants the world to know it. The soldier's life was brutal. We should not romanticize it. Ancient Egyptian warfare involved real violence, real fear, real death. Soldiers marched enormous distances in full kit under the Egyptian sun, carrying weapons and provisions, sleeping on the ground, fighting enemies who were also determined and also well-armed. Egyptian medical papyri, some of the oldest medical texts in existence, are full of the treatment of wounds, cuts and arrow strikes and broken bones and infections, described with a clinical precision that speaks to how frequently these injuries occurred and how well the Egyptian military medical system had become at dealing with them. We have found skeletons of Egyptian soldiers with healed wounds that speak to this. A man who survived a spear wound to the shoulder, the bone knitted and remodeled around the injury. Another who lost several teeth in what appears to have been a blow to the face and lived another 20 years. The body records everything, but for a young man with nothing, the risks of a military career could be worth it. And tens of thousands of young Egyptians across the centuries of the New Kingdom made exactly that calculation. Now, the pyramids. We have to talk about the pyramids. not the pyramids as monuments, their dimensions, their astronomical alignments, their engineering mysteries. That is a different story for a different night. Tonight, we are talking about the people, the actual human beings who built them, who they were, what they ate, what their days looked like, where they slept. And we have to begin by demolishing a myth so widespread, so deeply embedded in popular culture, that it has survived decades of archaeological evidence to the contrary. The pyramids were not built by slaves. Say it again clearly, because it contradicts something most people absorbed from movies and popular history and never questioned. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the most famous structure in the world, was not built by enslaved people dragged from their homes and worked to death in the desert sand. It was built by paid workers, organized, skilled, compensated, housed, fed. Workers who were buried with honor near the pyramids when they died, whose tombs we have found, whose skeletons we have examined, whose diet and health and social status we can reconstruct from the archaeological evidence with a precision that would astonish you. Here is what happened. In the 1990s, an American archaeologist named Mark Lehner began the systematic excavation of a site on the Giza Plateau that had been largely overlooked by previous generations of researchers. Previous Egyptologists had focused, understandably, on the pyramids themselves, on the tombs, the art, the royal inscriptions. The living quarters of the workers had attracted less attention. What Lehner found at a site called Hayt al-Ghurab, the Wall of the Crow, was a city, a real city, a purpose-built settlement of considerable size, constructed specifically to house, feed, and support the workforce building the pyramids. It had bakeries producing industrial quantities of bread. Bread jars have been found in their thousands at the site, enough to feed, by some estimates, 10,000 people every day. It had breweries, it had administrative buildings, it had dormitories, long gallery-style buildings where workers slept in organized groups like barracks. It had a medical facility, and it had a butchery. This is the detail that perhaps most strikingly demolishes the old slave narrative. The animal bones excavated at the workers' village show that the pyramid builders ate beef, not fish, not the occasional goat. Beef, prime cuts from cattle, the most expensive and prestigious food in ancient Egypt, the food that appears in offerings to the gods and at the tables of the wealthy. The pyramid workers ate better than most free Egyptians. They ate better in terms of protein and calories than the vast majority of the population. Their bones show it, robust, well-nourished, bearing the marks of hard physical labor, but not of malnutrition or starvation. And when they died, whether from accidents, illness, or simply the accumulated strain of years of extraordinary physical exertion, they were buried near the pyramids they had helped build in modest tombs prepared for the afterlife. Beer and bread jars buried with them. Their names, sometimes carved on the walls of their tombs. No one does that for slaves. More than that, we know their names. Not just the names of individuals, but the names of their work gangs. Inside the relieving chambers above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, spaces so tight you can only enter by crawling on your hands and knees. Spaces that no tourist has ever seen and no one visited for thousands of years after the pyramid was sealed. Archaeologists have found graffiti, red-painted marks made by the workers themselves, the names of their crews, the Friends of Khufu gang, the drunkards of Menkaure. These were not the dejected scratchings of enslaved prisoners. These were the equivalent of a sports team writing their name on their locker room wall. These were people proud enough of their work, their group, their identity, to leave their mark in a place they knew no one might ever see. They named themselves after the pharaoh not with bitterness, but with something that looks, across 4,000 years, like pride. Who were they, these builders? Archaeological evidence, combined with administrative documents, including the Wadi el-Jaf papyri, the oldest papyri ever found in Egypt, which document the logistics of pyramid construction in precise detail, gives us a picture. The workforce was organized in rotating shifts. Workers served for about 3 months at a time and were then replaced by a new rotation coming from villages across Egypt. Most were not permanent pyramid workers. They were farmers, conscripted for a season of state labor during the flood months when their fields were underwater anyway and there was no agricultural work to be done. Serving on the pyramid project was their labor tax obligation to the state, a way of paying what they owed, not in grain, but in time and sweat. But there was also a permanent core workforce, skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers, plasterers, painters, who lived year-round at the Giza workers' village. These were the specialists, the ones who had to be there continuously because their knowledge couldn't be replaced by a rotation of farmers. They lived in better quality housing within the village. Their families lived with them in some cases. Their children grew up on the plateau. The whole operation was administered by an army of scribes, of course. Every ration distributed, every stone block delivered, every worker's shift and absence and injury recorded in meticulous detail on papyrus and ostraca. The Wadi el-Jaf papyri, discovered in 2013 and dated to the reign of Khufu himself, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid, document in particular the work of a man named Deir, an inspector responsible for a crew of around 40 men who transported limestone blocks from a quarry to the pyramid site. The papyrus reads like a logbook, which is exactly what it is: dates, quantities, distances, the names of crew members, notes on conditions. Deir's crew transported stone for 3 months. Then they went home. And then another crew came, and then another, for 20 years, crew after crew after crew, each one spending their 3 months and then returning to their village and their fields, while the pyramid rose, course by course, stone by stone, toward the sky. Let's stand on the plateau for a moment and try to feel the scale of it. 20 years, approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, the average block weighing around 2.5 tons, about the weight of a modern car. Some blocks weigh 15 tons. The granite beams in the burial chamber weigh up to 80 tons each and were quarried not at Giza but at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, and transported by boat up the Nile. The mathematics of this project are so daunting that for centuries scholars argued it must have required supernatural assistance, or at least technology we no longer understand. It couldn't have been done by ordinary human labor with ordinary human tools. And yet it was. There is a ramp on the southwestern side of the pyramid, a mud and rubble construction discovered in recent excavations, that connects to a quarry just 300 meters away. Evidence of internal ramps, spiral ramps, built inside the pyramid structure as it rose, has been identified through a combination of archaeological analysis and particle imaging technology that can see through solid stone. The methods were ingenious, practical, and entirely human. The workers used wooden sledges to move the blocks across the plateau, with teams of men pulling on ropes while others poured water ahead of the sledge to reduce friction, an approach verified both by physical evidence and by a famous tomb painting from a slightly later period that shows exactly this technique, with a figure at the front of a sledge carefully pouring liquid onto the path while dozens of men haul the load. They used copper tools, chisels, saws, to cut the limestone, their edges resharpened constantly by metalworkers embedded in the workforce. They used wooden levers and counterweights to raise and position the stones. They used plumb lines and set squares to achieve the extraordinary precision of the finished surface, a precision so fine that the gap between adjacent blocks in the outer casing stones was, in places, less than half a millimeter. With copper tools and human muscle and 20 years of organized effort. One more thing about the pyramid workers that deserves its own moment. They had medical care. Real medical care. Not prayers and amulets, though those too, but actual surgical treatment administered by people who understood at least the basics of anatomy and wound management. We know this because of their bones. The skeletons excavated from the workers' cemetery near the pyramids show healed fractures. Not just small fractures, significant ones. A man who broke his forearm on the job and had the bone set and splintered and healed correctly, living for decades afterward. Another who suffered a compression fracture of a vertebra, the kind of injury that happens when something very heavy falls on you, and survived. Another with evidence of a healed skull trepanation, a hole drilled through the skull, a surgical procedure performed to relieve pressure, and the patient lived long enough for the bone to begin to remodel around the opening. The ancient Egyptian medical system was not primitive. It was, in many respects, the most sophisticated in the world of its time. Egyptian doctors are the first in recorded history to have examined the body systematically, to have understood the relationship between the brain and bodily function, to have classified wounds and diseases into categories and prescribed specific treatments. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text from around 1600 BCE, probably copied from an original 1,000 years older, reads like a clinical manual. Case by case, it describes injuries and their treatment, notes which are curable, which are treatable but uncertain, which are hopeless, and is ruthlessly, admirably honest about the limits of what medicine can achieve. The workers on the Giza Plateau had access to this medical system. When they were hurt, and they were hurt frequently because moving millions of tons of stone is extraordinarily dangerous work, there was someone there to treat them. Not just to offer prayers and send them home, but to set bones, clean wounds, suture cuts, and in some extraordinary cases perform surgery. They were not expendable. They were valued. Step back from the pyramid now. Step all the way back, until the individual blocks blur into the smooth geometric perfection of the whole, and the whole rises above the plateau in the early morning light. Its limestone casing still intact in this vision, still white and polished, catching the first sun and throwing it back across the desert in a blaze of reflected glory. 4,500 years ago, a man named Mera stood roughly where you are standing, watching his crew move stones across the plateau. He was a middle manager, essentially, an inspector, a man with a clipboard. He went home at the end of his 3-month shift and wrote up his records, and probably felt the mixed exhaustion and satisfaction of someone who has finished a hard job well. His name would not appear on any monument. The pharaoh Khufu, whose name was painted in red on the walls of the pyramid's hidden chambers, would be remembered forever. Mera would be forgotten within a generation. Except that he wasn't. His papyri were buried in a cave near the Red Sea, forgotten for 4,000 years, and discovered in 2013. And now we know his name. We know how many stones his crew moved and in how many days. We know he worked hard, documented everything, and did his job without complaint. The pyramid stands because of Khufu's vision, because of the mathematical genius of the architects, because of the engineering ingenuity of people whose names we mostly do not know. But it also stands because of Mera, and because of every man and woman who baked bread to feed the workers, every scribe who tracked the rations, every doctor who set a broken bone on the plateau, every copper tool sharpened and resharpened until it was too short to use, every rope braided and stretched and worn to nothing by the weight of stone, every 3-month shift that ended and was replaced by another, season after season, year after year, for 2 full decades. It stands because of ordinary people. It has always stood because of ordinary people, and it will stand until the sea swallows the desert, quietly and permanently bearing witness to what human beings can do when they decide to work together towards something larger than themselves. The sun is high over Giza now. The workers have broken for midday. They are sitting in the shade of the great wooden supply depot at the base of the plateau, passing around jars of beer, eating bread, talking about the afternoon's work. A few men are asleep already, backs against the cool side of a stone warehouse, hats pulled over their faces. Somewhere in the city behind the plateau, a scribe is bent over a fresh piece of papyrus, recording this morning's stone deliveries in careful hieratic. His handwriting is neat. His teacher beat the sloppiness out of him years ago. His ink is black. The sunlight through the high window lies across the page in a warm stripe. Somewhere else entirely, a young soldier is cleaning his copper-tipped spear, thinking about the campaign that begins next month, about whether the food will be good, about whether he will come home with enough gold to finally buy that piece of land. 3 lives. 3 paths through the same civilization, the scribe who turned words into power, the soldier who turned service into status, the builder who turned stone into eternity. None of them famous, all of them essential. Let the afternoon settle around you. Let the sound of the plateau fade, the creak of rope and wood, the distant thud of copper on stone, into something quieter, something like wind over warm sand. There is more of this world to explore. But there is time. There is always time in Egypt. The river teaches that. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine you are a woman in the ancient world. Pick any civilization you like. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China. You are an ordinary woman, not a queen, not a goddess. Just a woman living in a city, married, perhaps with children, perhaps with property you have inherited from your parents. In almost every case, in almost every civilization you could choose, your situation, legally speaking, is not good. In ancient Athens, you cannot own property in your own name. You cannot appear in court. You cannot sign a contract. You are, in the eyes of the law, a perpetual minor, forever under the guardianship of your father, or your husband, or your nearest male relative. You exist, legally, as an extension of a man. In ancient Rome, the situation is somewhat better in some periods and worse in others, but for much of Roman history, a married woman's property belongs to her husband, and her legal identity is absorbed into his. In ancient Mesopotamia, women have some protections under law. The Code of Hammurabi is not entirely without mercy, but they are still fundamentally defined by their relationship to men. Now imagine instead that you are a woman in ancient Egypt, and everything is different. Not perfectly different, not utopian. Ancient Egypt was still a patriarchal society in many meaningful ways. Men held the vast majority of official positions. Men's names were recorded more often in the historical record. Men generally led the public sphere. None of that is erased or denied. But in the eyes of the law, in the cold, practical machinery of contracts and courts and property records, an Egyptian woman was something the rest of the ancient world barely had a word for. She was a person, an independent legal person, in her own name, with her own rights, standing on her own 2 feet before the court. And that, in the ancient world, was extraordinary. Let's begin with a woman named Naunacht. She lived in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, the same extraordinary community we'll visit in full in the next chapter, during the reign of Rameses III and his successors, around 1150 BCE. She was, by the time she wrote the document that preserved her name for 3,000 years, an old woman. Her husband had died. She had survived him, as women in Egypt often did, since women generally worked in less physically dangerous occupations than men and tended to live longer. Naunacht had children, 8 of them, by 2 different marriages. And she was angry. Not furious, not bitter, just the calm, clear-eyed anger of an old woman who had worked hard her entire life, who had raised her children and cared for them and given them everything she had, and who now, in her final years, found that several of them were not returning the care she had given. So she did what any Egyptian woman of her time and standing could do. She went to the local court, and she dictated her will. The document survives, papyrus preserved in the dry desert air, found by archaeologists and now housed in a museum collection, studied by scholars who have spent careers learning to read its flowing hieratic script. And it is remarkable not because it is unusual, but because it is so utterly, completely ordinary. Naunakte lists her property. She specifies which children will inherit it. And then, in language that is polite but absolutely unmistakable in its meaning, she explains that several of her children, she names them, will receive nothing. Not because they have committed some crime, not because of any formal legal dispute, but because they had not looked after her in her old age. She had given them everything. They had given her nothing in return. "I am a free woman of Egypt," she says. "I have raised 8 children and given them everything appropriate to their station. But now I have grown old, and behold, they are not looking after me in my turn." She cuts them out. Just like that. With the full authority of the Egyptian legal system behind her, this old woman rewrites her will to punish the ungrateful and reward the devoted, as clearly and completely as any modern person writing a will in a lawyer's office today. She is not asking anyone's permission. She is not acting through a male guardian. She is Naunakte, free woman of Egypt, and this is her property to do with as she chooses. How did this happen? How did ancient Egypt develop a system of women's legal rights so far ahead of its time that it would not be matched in the Western world until the 19th century CE? The answer, most historians believe, begins with the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at was not simply a goddess, though there was a goddess of that name, a woman with a feather on her head, the feather of truth, the feather that was weighed against the human heart after death to determine whether a person had lived well. Ma'at was a principle, a cosmic organizing principle that the Egyptians placed at the very center of their understanding of how the world should work. Ma'at meant truth. Ma'at meant justice. Ma'at meant balance. And balance, that deep, almost mathematical commitment to equilibrium, extended into how the Egyptians thought about the relationship between men and women, not as identical, not as interchangeable, but as complementary. 2 necessary halves of a whole. The creation myths of ancient Egypt generally involved paired deities, male and female, god and goddess, working together to produce and sustain the world. This philosophy did not erase gender difference. Men and women in ancient Egypt had very different social roles, different expected behaviors, different pathways through life. But it did produce something genuinely remarkable. A legal system in which a woman was not the property of her father or her husband, but a person in her own right, capable of owning property, entering contracts, appearing before courts, and making her own decisions about her own life. Let's be specific, because the specifics are what make this astonishing. An Egyptian woman could own property, real property, land, houses, livestock, tools, goods. She could own it before marriage, during marriage, and after. When she married, her property did not become her husband's. It remained hers. The Papyrus Wilbur, a long administrative document recording taxes owed on farmland in the New Kingdom, lists more than 10% of the recorded landowners as women, women who were independently liable for taxes on land they personally owned. An Egyptian woman could appear in court, not through a male representative, not as someone else's dependent, in her own name, presenting her own case, giving her own testimony. Court records from Deir, el-Medina and other sites include women as active litigants, women suing men, women being sued, women serving as witnesses. An Egyptian woman could initiate divorce, Either party could end a marriage. If the husband initiated it, he was required to return his wife's dowry and pay her a fine. If she initiated it, she paid no fine, took her own property, and received a share, 1/3, of the marital property they had accumulated together. If there were children, their share was set aside separately, with the husband managing it on their behalf until they were old enough to claim it themselves. An Egyptian woman could write a will. As Naunakta demonstrated, she could leave her property to whoever she chose. She did not have to leave it to her husband. She did not have to leave it to any specific person. An Egyptian woman could run a business, could lend money, could hire workers, could buy and sell goods in the market under her own name. Upper-class women in some periods ran perfume businesses, textile operations, and trade enterprises. A woman from Deir el-Medina is recorded in the Ostraka as having lent grain to a neighbor and then taken the neighbor to court when he failed to repay it. She won. And yet, we must be honest about the gap between legal right and lived reality, because ancient Egypt is not a fairy tale. The law said women were equal. Life was more complicated. Most women in ancient Egypt spent most of their lives within the household, managing the home, raising children, grinding grain, weaving linen, preserving food. Not because the law required it, but because society expected it, because the rhythms of daily life made it practical, because the alternative required resources, time, money, social connections, that most women, especially in the peasant and working classes, simply didn't have. The scribal schools that led to official positions were, in practice, almost exclusively male. We have a very small number of references to women who could read and write, but they are exceptional, not typical. The great administrative offices, the military commands, the priesthoods of the major gods, these were overwhelmingly male domains. Women served as priestesses, particularly of the goddess Hathor, and music and religious ritual were areas where female participation was not just permitted, but celebrated. Some women rose to remarkable positions. The god's wife of Amun was one of the most powerful religious roles in the New Kingdom, held by royal women, and at certain points in history, these women wielded political influence that rivaled that of the pharaoh's officials. But a woman who worked in the fields, who ground grain every morning before sunrise, who wove linen and raised children and managed the household with the competent, tireless efficiency that the whole economy depended on. That woman's legal rights, however real on papyrus, were in many ways theoretical. The law was a safety net, not a ladder. It caught you when you fell. It didn't necessarily lift you up. The gap between what the law allowed and what daily life provided was real, and we should acknowledge it. And yet, even as a safety net, those rights mattered enormously, because one day your husband might die, or become ill, or disappear, or simply stop being someone you could live with. And on that day, the fact that you had legal standing, that your property was yours, that you could go to court, that you could make a will, that you could remarry or not remarry as you chose. On that day, those rights were the difference between independence and destitution. Ancient Egyptian women knew this. They used those rights. The records prove it. Now, the children. Let's get lower to the ground. Literally. Let's sit on the floor of a mud brick house in ancient Thebes and watch what it is like to be a child in this world. A very young child in ancient Egypt, in the first few years of life, wore, quite typically, nothing at all, or almost nothing. The tomb paintings that document everyday life with such extraordinary detail show young children almost universally naked. Their heads shaved, except for a single side lock of hair left on the right side of the head, a distinctive style called the side lock of youth, which marked a child as a child, and which we see on children's figures in art across thousands of years of Egyptian history. The side lock was eventually cut as part of the formal transition into adulthood. But until it was cut, it meant this person is still becoming. The nakedness was practical. Egypt is hot. Linen is expensive to make. Children grow fast. There is no reason to clothe a 3-year-old in a society where the temperature rarely drops below what we would consider a warm spring day. But there is something touching about it too. The casual, unembarrassed freedom of it. Children running in the street without shoes and without clothes, entirely comfortable in a world that accepted their small bodies without apology. What did Egyptian children play with? More than you might expect. Archaeologists have found an abundance of children's toys across Egypt, from simple objects made of clay and scraps of fabric to surprisingly sophisticated wooden constructions. And what strikes you, looking at this collection across time, is how familiar it all seems. There were dolls, flat, paddle-shaped wooden dolls with painted faces and hair made of beaded strings, fabric dolls stuffed with papyrus reeds, clay figurines of people and animals. Some of the dolls found at Deir el-Medina still have their bead hair intact after 3,000 years, the tiny faded beads still strung on their threads. There were pull toys, a wooden mouse on a wheeled base with a string attached so a child could drag it across the floor. A horse and rider, the string long since gone, but the hole through which it ran still clearly visible. You can picture, without any effort at all, a small child running through the house, with one of these things bouncing along behind them, the way children run with toys today. The movement is the same, the joy is the same. There were balls made of leather stuffed with horsehair, or woven papyrus, or tightly wound strips of cloth. Some balls had elaborate painted designs. Ball games of all kinds were played, tossing, juggling, catching. And tomb paintings show groups of girls playing a game that looks very much like a precursor to modern juggling, keeping multiple balls in the air at once with a skill and flair that suggests serious practice. There were spinning tops, cone-shaped, often painted, spun with the fingers or with a cord. The basic design has not changed in 5,000 years. A child from ancient Egypt could pick up a modern spinning top and immediately understand what to do with it. There were board games. 2 board games in particular were enormously popular in ancient Egypt, played by everyone from children to pharaohs, and present in the archaeological record across virtually the entire length of Egyptian civilization. The first was Senet. Senet was so beloved that pharaohs were buried with their Senet boards so that they could play it in the afterlife. The game involves moving pieces across a grid of 30 squares, with the direction and distance of movement determined by throwing sticks or knuckle bones, an early form of dice. The exact rules have been partially lost, but what survives tells us enough to know that it involved both strategy and luck, and that it carried religious significance. The squares represented stages of the journey through the underworld, and to win at Senet was, symbolically, to successfully navigate the passage to eternal life. This is, in essence, the oldest board game in the history of the world, and children played it on their living room floors. The second was Mehen, named after the serpent god. The playing board was shaped like a coiled snake, the snake's body divided into segments that served as the track for the pieces. The game dates to the Old Kingdom and was most popular in the early periods of Egyptian history. Alongside these, there were simpler games, hopscotch or something very like it, played with patterns scratched in the dust, leapfrog, tug-of-war, wrestling, which was a popular sport for both children and adults, swimming in the Nile, which was common and joyful, and also, it must be said, occasionally dangerous. The Nile was not merely a river, but an ecosystem, and some of what lived in it was very interested in small, splashing children. Beyond the toys and the games, what was childhood actually like? The short answer is that it was short, not in the sense that children died young, though some did, and infant mortality in ancient Egypt was significant enough that parents expected to lose children and grieved them with a depth and specificity that the archaeological record makes heartbreakingly clear. There are small coffins, painted with care. There are amulets clearly made for infants. There are letters written to the dead asking for their intercession on behalf of the living family left behind. But childhood in ancient Egypt was short in the sense that the transition to adult responsibility came early. Children began contributing to the household economy as soon as they were physically able. Not in a coercive way, not in the way we associate with the worst abuses of child labor, but organically, as a natural extension of life in a pre-industrial society where every pair of hands mattered. A 7-year-old could fetch water, carry messages, watch a younger sibling. A 10-year-old could help with the harvest. A 12-year-old could begin a formal apprenticeship in a trade. Girls married young, often between 12 and 14 years old. This is uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, and it should be. Child marriage, from a modern medical and ethical perspective, is harmful, but in the context of ancient Egypt it was simply the norm, understood as the natural beginning of a woman's adult life. The marriage was not necessarily immediate consummation. There is evidence of betrothal contracts that acknowledged a girl's young age while establishing the framework for a future household. But the principle that girlhood ended early and womanhood began at puberty was universal in the ancient world. Boys' transitions were defined more by trade than by marriage. The age at which a boy was expected to take on adult labor, to begin his apprenticeship, to be treated as a working member of the community, varied by circumstance. But somewhere between 12 and 15, most boys in ancient Egypt had already crossed the invisible line and become young men with responsibilities. There is a painting in the tomb of a man named Nebamun, an official who lived in Thebes around 1350 BCE, whose tomb fragments now live in the British Museum, that shows a scene so vivid, so alive, that it stops people in their tracks even today. It is a feast. Men and women recline on cushions and stools, dressed in their finest white linen, their hair elaborate and oiled, their eyes dark with kohl. Servants circulate with food and wine. Musicians play. A group of women, their instruments including a lute, a double flute and a small hand drum, their bodies turned in positions that suggest they are in motion, that the music is alive and moving. Dancers weave between the guests, their bodies bent in ways that speak of long training, and in one corner, barely visible unless you know to look for it, there are children. Not performing, not serving, just there, watching the feast from the margins, as children at adult parties have always watched, with that wide-eyed mixture of fascination and incomprehension that comes from witnessing a world you have not yet been invited to enter. They are sitting close together. One of them, you cannot tell if it is a boy or a girl, the paint has faded, has a hand raised slightly, as if pointing at something. Look at that, they seem to be saying to the child next to them. Look at that. 3,000 years later, you can still almost hear them. One more piece of this world before we move on. Love. The ancient Egyptians wrote love poetry. Real love poetry, not the formal and distant hymns to divine beauty that you might expect from a civilization famous for its solemnity. Actual love poetry, personal, immediate, aching with longing and joy, and the specific, irreducible reality of wanting another particular person. We have a collection called The Cairo Love Songs, written during the New Kingdom, and they read as if someone wrote them last week. A young man thinks about a girl who lives across the river from him. He cannot cross to see her. His family doesn't know he loves her. The crocodile in the river doesn't frighten him half as much as the possibility that she doesn't know he exists. A girl describes seeing the boy she loves from a distance and the way her heart leaps in her chest, the way she suddenly cannot control her body, the way her hands go clumsy and her voice leaves her. She describes it exactly. My heart flutters hastily when I think of my love of you. There are poems about longing, about jealousy, about the first morning after, about missing someone who is traveling, about the absurdity of being completely helpless in the face of another person's existence. The emotions in these poems are not ancient. They are immediate, embarrassingly, achingly immediate, because love, the bewildering, ungovernable force of human romantic love, has not changed at all in 3,000 years. The words for it change, the rituals around it change, the specific rules of courtship and marriage and social expectation all change beyond recognition. But the feeling of seeing someone across a room or across a river and having your whole body reorient itself around the fact of their existence, that feeling is the same. That feeling is the most perfectly conserved thing in all of human history. There is one more woman we should meet before we close this chapter. She is the most extraordinary woman in Egyptian history who did not rule as pharaoh, though she came close enough that the line is arguable. Her name was Nefertiti, not the wife of a pyramid builder, the wife of a pharaoh, specifically the great royal wife of Akhenaten, the heretic king who tried to overturn the entire Egyptian religious order and replace a pantheon of thousands of gods with the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten. This happened around 1350 BCE, and the story of Akhenaten's religious revolution is one of the most dramatic episodes in Egyptian history. But we are here for Nefertiti. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and the bust of her that sits in the Neues Museum in Berlin, discovered in 1912, still startling in its vivid color and extraordinary modernity, is one of the most reproduced works of art in the world. The painted limestone face with its high cheekbones and long neck and steady, darkly outlined eyes looks not like an ancient artifact, but like a contemporary portrait. People stand before it and feel, with a directness that other ancient artworks rarely produce, that they are looking at a specific person, a woman who was alive. What made Nefertiti remarkable beyond her famous beauty was her power. At the height of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti appears in official inscriptions and monuments with a frequency and prominence unmatched by any previous queen. She is shown in scenes traditionally reserved for the pharaoh, smiting enemies, making offerings to the gods, driving a chariot. Her image appears on monuments from one end of Egypt to the other. Some scholars believe she effectively co-ruled with her husband. Some believe she ruled alone, perhaps under a different name, for a period after Akhenaten's death. The evidence is tantalizing and frustratingly incomplete. What is certain is that she was not merely a decorative figure at a powerful man's side. She was, in the fullest sense, a presence, and she is the sharpest possible illustration of what Egyptian women's legal and social status could become at its highest extension in the right moment, with the right combination of circumstances and personality. A woman who was not merely permitted to exist alongside power, a woman who was power. The house is quiet now. The children are asleep, the little ones on their mats, tangled together for warmth in the cooler desert night, the older ones stretched out with the sprawling abandon of people who haven't yet learned to sleep carefully. The toys are scattered where they were left, a wooden mouse on its side near the door, a Senate board with its pieces still arranged from an interrupted game. Nefertari sits in the front room, too warm to sleep, a small oil lamp burning on the ledge beside her. She has a piece of linen in her lap that needs mending, though she's not really mending it. She is just sitting with it in her hands, in the way people sit with small tasks when what they actually need is to let their mind go quiet. Through the open doorway, the street is dark and still. Somewhere far off, a dog gives a single bark and then falls silent. The stars above the rooftops are very bright. She thinks about her daughter, who will be old enough to marry within a few years. She thinks about what she will make sure to tell her, about the dowry contract, about the importance of having her property clearly recorded, about what she herself was told by her own mother, and what her mother was told by hers, back and back through the generations. These are your rights. Know them, use them. Don't let anyone take them from you. The oil lamp flickers once. Nefertari adjusts the wick with the tip of her finger, a practiced automatic gesture done 1,000 times. The lamp steadies. The house breathes around her. Tomorrow there will be bread to make and water to carry and children to wake and feed and send into the world. But right now, for a little while, there is just this: the quiet room, the steady lamp, the stars, and 3,000 years of women sitting exactly like this, holding something in their hands, thinking about the people they love. The world is very old, and in some rooms, at some hours, it is very, very still. Imagine that you could pick up a neighborhood newspaper from 3,000 years ago. Not a royal proclamation, not a religious text, not a pharaoh's victory inscription carved into a temple wall in letters a foot tall. A neighborhood newspaper, the kind of publication that reports on local disputes and small scandals, and who borrowed whose cloak and hasn't returned it. The kind that lists births and deaths and marriages. The kind that carries the complaint of a man who received bad medical treatment and wants everyone to know about it. The kind with love notes slipped between the pages and workplace gossip recorded for no reason other than that it happened and someone thought it worth writing down. That newspaper exists. It is not printed on paper and it is not bound in a cover. It is written on thousands upon thousands of limestone chips and pottery fragments, in the fast-flowing cursive of ancient Egyptian hieratic, scattered across a site in the western hills above Luxor that most tourists drive past on their way to the Valley of the Kings without stopping. The site is called Deir el-Medina, and it is the single most extraordinary window into ordinary human life that the ancient world has left us. Let's go there, west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes. You cross the river by ferry, as Egyptians have crossed it since before history was recorded, and the city recedes behind you, its noise and smell giving way to the particular quiet of the western bank, which is the quiet of the dead, the necropolis side. The side where the sun sets, where the sky every evening is painted in the same colors as the ochre and crimson walls of the tombs cut into the cliffs ahead. You walk south along a path that winds between rocky hills, past the great mortuary temples, the immense stone structures where priests maintained the cults of deceased pharaohs long after the kings themselves were sealed in their cliff tombs miles further on. The path is dry and pale and the sun is heavy. A few donkeys pass carrying water jars. A Medjay policeman, one of the Nubian officers who served as the valley's security force, controlling access to the sacred burial sites, watches from a rocky outcrop with the particular alertness of a man who takes his job seriously. And then you come around a curve in the path, and there it is, Set Mat, the place of truth. A small walled village, compact and self-contained, nestled in a narrow valley between two ridges of limestone. From the outside it looks modest, a rectangle of mud brick walls, the rooftops just visible above them, a small temple at the northern end, the desert pressing in on three sides. Maybe 70 houses within the walls. At most, in its peak period, perhaps 1,000 people living here, small, isolated, unremarkable to look at, and absolutely bursting with life. The village was not an organic settlement that grew up gradually around a resource or a road. It was a planned community, deliberately built and deliberately maintained, founded during the early 18th dynasty, specifically to house one very particular group of workers: the craftsmen, painters, stonemasons, plasterers, and scribes who would spend their careers building and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This was, in the ancient world, an extraordinary arrangement. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom had made a decision that their predecessors in the Old and Middle Kingdoms had not. They would not build monuments that advertised where they were buried. The massive pyramids that had announced the tombs of the Old Kingdom pharaohs had also, not entirely coincidentally, announced to every tomb robber in Egypt exactly where to dig. By the time the New Kingdom began, many of the great pyramid complexes had already been systematically looted, their treasures stripped, their mummies desecrated. So the New Kingdom pharaohs went underground. Literally. They cut their tombs deep into the limestone cliffs of a hidden valley on the western bank, the Valley of the Kings, with no surface monument to mark the location. No pyramid, no visible structure. Just a door cut into the rock face, sealed and hidden, in a valley guarded by a natural pyramid of stone that rose above it on the ridgeline like a mountain-shaped coincidence. The workers who built and decorated these tombs knew where they were. They knew what was in them. They knew the layout of every corridor, the location of every hidden chamber, the quality and quantity of the treasures buried with each king. This made them extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily dangerous. They were called servants in the place of truth, and they were required to remain discreet, a discretion enforced not just by loyalty, but by geography. The village was isolated, accessible by limited routes, monitored by the Medjay police who controlled movement in and out. You did not simply wander into Setmat, you had a reason to be there, or you were turned back. And the workers, for the most part, stayed. Generation after generation, the same families. Sons following fathers into the tombs, daughters marrying the sons of other workers' families, uncles teaching nephews the precise angle of a chisel for cutting limestone, the exact proportion of pigment to binding medium for a wall painting that would still be vivid 3,000 years later. They were, in every sense, a community unto themselves. What makes Deir el-Medina unique among all ancient sites is the sheer volume and range of written material recovered there. Archaeologists have found over 10,000 ostraka, along with dozens of papyri containing administrative records, private letters, legal texts, and religious writings. 10,000. Let that number sit for a moment. 10,000 individual pieces of writing from a village of perhaps 1,000 people, covering roughly 400 years. That is an average of 25 pieces of written text per year, from a community that was not a government center, not a temple, not a school, just a neighborhood. A neighborhood where ordinary people wrote things down constantly, casually, habitually, the way we might send a text message or jot a note on a scrap of paper. Many of these ostraka were not meant to be held onto for any length of time, and more often than not found their way into the rubbish heap just outside the town, which is exactly where archaeologists found them, thousands of years later, preserved by the dry desert air in the dump where they had been thrown away. Someone's trash, the most valuable archive in the ancient world. The great irony of Deir el-Medina is that we know so much about it precisely because its residents were careless. They wrote things down, used the writing, and threw it away, and the desert kept everything. Walk through the village gate, and you are immediately in the main street. It is not wide. 2 people walking toward each other can pass comfortably, but 3 would require negotiation. The houses on either side press close. Their walls are plastered and whitewashed on the outside, brilliant in the morning sun, faded and slightly dirty at knee height, where the street dust has worked its way into the plaster over years of casual contact. The houses are small, smaller than they look from outside. A typical house at Deir el-Medina had 4 rooms and a cellar, with a rooftop above that served as additional living and working space. The first room you enter from the street is the reception room, and in an interesting variation from the standard Egyptian house at Deir el-Medina. This front room seems to have included a small enclosed space, a low platform with a canopy, that scholars believe was used as a birthing room. The front of the house, the most public space, was where new life began. The second room was the main living area, slightly larger, with a raised dais along one wall where the family spent their leisure time. The ceiling here was higher. Sometimes the roof was supported by a single wooden column, and a small window let in a stripe of dusty light. Kitchen in the back, cellar under the kitchen floor, accessed by a trapdoor used for storage where the temperature stayed lower. And above everything, the rooftop, reached by a flight of mud brick stairs on the outside of the house, where grain dried and linen bleached in the sun, and the family slept on summer nights. In one house near the center of the village, archaeologists found, still in place 3,000 years after it was put there, a small wooden shelf fixed to the wall of the second room. On it, a painted clay figure of Bes, the household protector god, stood guard. Beside Bes, a small painted cone, a decorative object whose exact purpose is still debated. Below the shelf, a faded stain on the floor that might once have been a mat. Someone's living room, preserved exactly as they left it. Now, the gossip. Because Deir el-Medina is not just historically significant, it is, in many passages of its written record, genuinely entertaining. The ostraca and papyri from this village contain some of the most vivid, immediate human writing that has survived from the ancient world, not because it was written to survive, but precisely because it wasn't. These were notes dashed off in the heat of the moment, complaints written in anger, accusations committed to limestone, while the indignation was still fresh. Let's start with Paneb. Paneb was the son of an overseer, which is to say he came from a family of some standing in the village, and he was accused in a complaint preserved on papyrus of a remarkable catalogue of offences. The complaint, written by a man named Amenacht and addressed to the vizier, the highest official in Egypt below the pharaoh himself, lists Paneb's crimes with the building momentum of someone who has been waiting a long time to get all of this off his chest. It reads, Paneb slept with the lady Tui when she was the wife of the workman Kenna. He slept with the lady Hel when she was with Pendua. He slept with the lady Hel when she was with Hesisunabeth. And when he had slept with Hel, he slept with Webket, her daughter. Moreover, Apekti, his son, also slept with Webket, father and son, the same woman. The complaint goes on. Paneb is also accused of looting a royal tomb, a capital offence, the most serious crime possible for a man whose entire livelihood depended on the sanctity of those tombs. He is accused of stealing stone from the royal construction sites for use in his own tomb. He is accused of threatening workers who testified against him. He is accused of being drunk on the job. He is accused of, on one occasion, sitting on top of the vizier's own sedan chair, apparently as a deliberate act of disrespect so outrageous that it warranted specific mention in a formal legal complaint. The outcome of his case is not known, but surviving records indicate the execution of a head of workmen at this time. Whether this was Paneb himself, or someone caught in the general chaos his behavior created, the record does not make entirely clear. But here is the thing about Paneb. He's not a monster in the record, he is a person, a specific, infuriating, unmistakably human person. The kind of man every community has produced in every era of history, the one who takes more than his share and somehow gets away with it longer than he should. The kind of man whose behavior generates enough paperwork to survive 3,000 years. He is exhausting. He is familiar. He is 3,000 years old. Not all the drama at Deir el-Medina was quite so spectacular. Most of it was mundane in the way that real life is mundane. Small grievances, minor injustices, the everyday friction of people living in close proximity and depending on each other. One letter accuses a neighbor of borrowing a cloak and failing to return it. The tone of this letter, preserved on an ostracon, probably thrown away after it was delivered, caught by the dry desert air and kept for 3 millennia, is the tone of someone who has asked nicely more than once and is now putting it in writing because they want a record. The cloak is described, the borrowing is described, the failure to return is described. The letter ends with a demand for the cloak's return or its equivalent value in goods. We do not know if the cloak was ever returned. We never will, but the fact that someone thought it worth writing about, this small, ordinary, completely human dispute over a borrowed piece of clothing, is exactly what makes Deir el-Medina so precious. This is not history as kings and battles. This is history as it is actually lived in the accumulated weight of small things. Borrowed cloaks, late rations, a neighbor's goat that keeps getting into your grain storage, a colleague who takes credit for your work, a festival where someone was treated unfairly and wrote a complaint about it. Life, just life. The community had its own court of law, made up of a foreman, deputies, craftsmen, and a court scribe, and was authorized to deal with all civil and some criminal cases, typically relating to the non-payment of goods or services. This local court, called the Kenbet, met regularly in an open area of the village, and its proceedings were recorded in detail by the court scribe. We have those records. Dozens of cases, spanning generations, giving us an almost sociological view of how conflict was managed in a tight-knit community that couldn't afford to let disputes fester. The cases are varied and fascinating. A man sues his neighbor over a donkey that was supposed to be returned and wasn't. The neighbor claims the donkey died while in his care. The court rules that he must pay compensation regardless. The man who lost the donkey wins. A woman brings a case against her former employer, a woman of higher status for whom she had worked as a servant, claiming she was owed payment that was never delivered. The ostracon recording this case is fragmentary, the outcome unclear. But the fact of a servant woman standing before a court and making a claim against her employer is itself remarkable. A workman disputes the terms of a property sale that happened years before his time, involving his late father's estate. The case requires calling witnesses who remember the original transaction. Two remember it one way, one remembers it differently. The court deliberates. One dispute involving the chief of police lasted 11 years. 11 years, in a village of perhaps 1,000 people, where everyone knew everyone, where you would pass the man you were suing at the well every morning and at the temple every festival day. 11 years of litigation, documented in the records, before whatever resolution was finally reached. The ancient Egyptians were patient litigants, or perhaps simply stubborn. There was another kind of court at Deir el-Medina, one that operated by entirely different rules. The oracle. At festivals, the statue of the deified pharaoh Amenhotep III, who was worshipped at Deir el-Medina as a patron and protector of the village, was carried through the streets on a portable bark by a team of priests. And as the statue was carried, people could approach it with questions and disputes. If the bark moved forward under the bearer's hands, it meant yes. If it moved backward or stopped, it meant no. This sounds, to modern ears, like superstition, a random physical process dressed up as divine judgment, and in some sense, of course, it was. The bearers were human, subject to suggestion and bias and their own opinions about who was right in any given dispute. But here is the thing. It worked, or at least it worked in the sense that the community accepted its verdicts. When the oracle ruled in your favor, the person who had wronged you was publicly shamed by divine authority in front of the entire village. When the oracle ruled against you, continuing to press your case became an act of impiety, as well as stubbornness. The oracle was not neutral, but it was communal. It brought the village together to witness the resolution of conflict, to make the resolution public, and therefore binding in a way that a private court ruling could never quite be. The villagers consulted oracles about many aspects of their lives, including justice, not just legal disputes, personal questions. Should I take this job? Is this dream a good omen? Which of these two men should I sell my donkey to? The oracle was a kind of communal decision-making mechanism, a way of externalizing choices that felt too heavy to carry alone. We have ostraca, that record oracle questions, real questions, written out carefully, folded up, and placed before the statue. Some of them have been found still folded, still waiting for an answer that never came, or that came and was forgotten, or that came and was satisfying enough that the questioner moved on and didn't need to keep the paper. Little folded questions from 3,000 years ago. What do I do? What is right? Which way should I go? The workers themselves were organized into two teams, the left side and the right side, each responsible for one half of whatever tomb was currently being cut. This division was not just organizational, it was social. The two teams had their own foremen, their own scribes, their own internal hierarchies, their own slightly competitive pride in the quality of their work versus the other side. Their work weeks were, by ancient standards, remarkably structured. The artisans worked in shifts, rotating in and out of the Valley of the Kings on a schedule. They spent 8 days at the valley, camping in stone huts near the worksite, and then 2 days off at the village. Then 8 days back, then 2 days off. The 2-day weekend, 3,000 years before the concept became standard in the industrialized world, the workers of Deir el-Medina had a 2-day break every 10 days built into their work schedule. They did not always spend those days resting. The ostraca record, in meticulous detail, the reasons workers gave for their absences, and this list is one of the most charming and humanizing things in all of Egyptian archaeology. The scribe, Amenacht, kept an attendance record with the careful thoroughness of someone who knew the paperwork would be checked, and into that record he faithfully transcribed the excuses of his colleagues. Absent because he was ill, absent because his mother was ill, absent because he was making his mother's coffin, absent because his wife was ill, absent because he was brewing beer, absent because he had a dispute, absent because a scorpion bit him, absent because he was hungover. The actual word used translates with admirable directness as drunk, absent because he was wrapping his dead, absent because he was building his house, absent because his daughter was ill. And then, with no explanation or elaboration, repeated across multiple entries for one particular worker. Absent. Just absent. No reason given. The scribe didn't push. He just noted it and moved on. That man who kept being absent with no explanation. Did he hate his job? Was he dealing with something too private to name? Was he simply the kind of person who showed up when he felt like it and didn't particularly care what the attendance record said? We will never know. But for a moment, across 3,000 years, he feels completely real. The work they did when they showed up was extraordinary, not in spite of being ordinary men, because they were ordinary men, men with absences and hangovers and sick wives and beer to brew, who nonetheless produced, in the hours they were present and the days they felt well, some of the most magnificent art in human history. The tomb of Seti the Fun in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Queen Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens, the tomb of Ramesses VI, whose ceiling is painted with the entire journey of the sun through the night sky in such detail and such color that it functions as an astronomical map. These were made by the workers of Deir el-Medina, by the men whose excuses are recorded in Amenacht's attendance roll. The man who was hungover on Tuesday painted the resurrection of Osiris on Wednesday. This is not a contradiction. It is simply what human beings are. We contain, all of us, both the hangover and the masterpiece, the brilliant and the banal, the transcendent and the completely comfortably ordinary. Inside the tombs, the workers left evidence of themselves beyond the official paintings. Graffiti that workers left in certain tombs show moments of humor and daily commentary, offering rare glimpses of their personalities. Not just names, though those too, but brief, casual notations that feel like someone dashing off a comment in a margin. The painter Nebnefer came here. This is a good place. A rough sketch of a cat, a small caricature, we have found them on ostraca, of a pharaoh drawn in a deliberately unflattering style, the kind of thing you draw when you're bored and no one important is looking. And sometimes, love notes. Workers writing messages to other workers on the blank backs of limestone chips, slipping them to a friend or a neighbor's wife during a break in the day. Some are tender. Some are explicit. All of them are human in a way that official Egyptian art, with its formal poses and divine perfection, almost never permits. These are people who worked in a place of perfection and left behind evidence of their imperfection, who painted gods and wrote gossip, who created eternity and complained about cloaks. An interesting aspect of Deir el-Medina that sets it apart from most Egyptian villages is that the community seems to have been well educated, with most of its inhabitants, including women, having the ability to read and possibly write. This is unusual. In most of Egypt, literacy was confined to the scribal class and the educated elite. But at Deir el-Medina, the constant presence of written records, the daily need to communicate through ostraca, the culture of documentation that permeated the village, all of this seems to have produced a broader literacy than was typical anywhere else in the ancient world. Women at Deir el-Medina wrote letters, not many, but enough to be documented. A woman named Irinifer sent a letter to her son asking for help. A woman called Heria wrote to a colleague about a business matter. Women in the village were able to own land and were entitled to their own wealth and 1/3 of all marital goods, goods that belonged solely to them in case of divorce or the husband's death. The women of the village were also supplied with servants by the government to help them with the grinding of grain and the cleaning of laundry. A recognition that with the men working in the valley 8 days out of every 10, the domestic labor of maintaining the village fell almost entirely on the women, and that this labor required support. The village, for most of the time, ran on the women. The men were at the valley, in their stone huts above the tomb entrances, working by lamplight in corridors that the sun never reached. And at home in the village, the women were grinding and weaving and trading and litigating and raising children and managing the household economy with the same systematic competence that the men applied to cutting corridors in limestone. Different skills, the same civilization, both necessary. There is one more piece of the Deir el-Medina story that deserves a moment all its own: the tombs. Not the royal tombs the workers were employed to build, their own tombs. At the southern edge of the village, climbing up the hillside in orderly terraced rows, are the private tombs of the Deir el-Medina workers. The men who spent their careers painting the burial chambers of pharaohs applied the same skill, the same care, the same astonishing artistry to their own modest tombs. And the result is, in many ways, more affecting than anything in the Valley of the Kings, because these are personal. The royal tombs are magnificent in their scale, their grandeur, their theological complexity. They were designed to impress the gods, to navigate the cosmic machinery of the afterlife, to secure the resurrection of a divine king. They are awe-inspiring, but the workers' tombs are intimate. They show real people, real lives. A man named Sennacherib is shown in his tomb playing senet with his wife, the two of them seated across from each other, her hand resting on the game board, both of them painted with a tenderness and specificity that is not about theology. It is about two people who loved each other and wanted that love to be what they were remembered for, even in eternity. Another tomb shows a worker named Ipui with his wife and children. His cat is under his chair. His monkey is in the tree above his head. The family is gathered together in the shade of their garden. The painter, almost certainly Ipui himself, or someone who knew him, has captured not a generic ideal of a happy family, but this family, these faces, this garden. These people wanted to be remembered as themselves, not as their jobs, not as their titles, not as their service to the pharaoh whose tomb they built, as themselves, as the people they were when the work was done and the lampblack was washed from their hands, and they came home to the village and sat in the shade with the people they loved. It is evening at Deir el-Medina. The light has gone from gold to copper to the deep rose of a Theban sunset, and the limestone hills above the village are glowing like heated metal. The shadows in the street are long and cool. Somewhere inside a house, someone is playing a stringed instrument, a lute maybe, or a harp, and the sound drifts over the rooftops in small, imprecise fragments. At the far end of the street, two men are having an argument. Their voices carry without the words being audible. The rhythm of two people who know each other too well to bother being polite, who have been having this same argument in various forms for years. It will end, as it always ends, with one of them throwing up his hands and walking away, and the other standing there for a moment feeling simultaneously victorious and slightly ridiculous. Tomorrow, one of them will write a complaint to the foreman. The foreman will sigh. He will note it down. The scribe will record the note on an ostracon. The ostracon will be thrown in the rubbish pile to the north of the village, where it will lie under a gradually accumulating blanket of sand and limestone chips and broken pottery for 3,000 years. And then an archaeologist will pick it up, brush it off, hold it to the light and begin to read, and two men who had an argument in the street one evening in ancient Egypt will be alive again, briefly, in the hands of someone who never expected to meet them. This is what Deir el-Medina is. Not just history, not just archaeology. A conversation that never quite ended, still going, still going. You wake up in the middle of the night. The house is dark. The oil lamp in the corner has burned down to nothing, and the room around you is the particular blackness of a place with no windows and no ambient light, the deep, soft dark of an ancient Egyptian night, before electric light existed anywhere in the world. You had a dream, and in ancient Egypt, a dream was not just a dream, it was a message. It could be a warning from a god who had something to say to you. It could be a communication from a dead ancestor who needed help navigating the afterlife, or who wanted to alert you to a danger, or who was, for reasons the living might not entirely understand, making your life difficult from the other side. It could be a prophecy, it could be a test, it could be something that required immediate attention, a visit to the temple, a consultation with a specialist, a protective ritual performed before the sun came up. Or it could be nothing. It could be the random firing of a tired mind. The problem was knowing which, and this is precisely why, in ancient Egypt, there were professionals who specialized in exactly that question. The ancient Egyptians had dream interpreters, not just in the royal court, where the pharaoh's dreams carried cosmic significance and were interpreted by the most senior temple priests with enormous political stakes attached to the result, in ordinary neighborhoods, available to ordinary people. Women, primarily, though not exclusively, the wise women of Egyptian communities, called seers, were among the most respected figures in local religious life, and dream interpretation was one of their central skills. They were not frauds. They were not performing for credulous customers. Within the worldview of ancient Egypt, dream interpretation was a completely rational service, as sensible as visiting a doctor. Dreams came from somewhere. That somewhere was the divine realm. The divine realm was real. Therefore, understanding the dream correctly was important practical work. We have an Egyptian dream manual, an actual surviving text written on papyrus that contains hundreds of dream scenarios and their interpretations. It begins simply and practically. If a man sees himself in a dream doing such and such a thing, it means such and such an outcome. Some interpretations are straightforward. Dreaming of drinking warm beer means suffering. Dreaming of your face in a mirror means another wife. Dreaming that you are eating crocodile meat means becoming an official. A good omen, the crocodile being associated with power and authority. Others are more puzzling from a modern perspective, but made complete internal sense within Egyptian symbolic language, where every object and creature and color carried specific divine associations. The moon meant something. The color white meant something different from the color red. A specific bird was the embodiment of a specific divine principle. Reading a dream was, in effect, translating from one symbolic language into another. And when you woke in the dark, heart beating, with the residue of a vivid dream still painted across your mind, you might lie there for a while trying to work it out yourself, matching your images against what you knew of divine symbolism. And if you couldn't work it out, or if the dream was frightening, or repeatedly recurring, or so strange that it demanded professional attention, you would go in the morning to see the seer. She would listen carefully. She would ask questions, she would consult her own knowledge and perhaps her texts, and she would tell you what the gods were trying to say. But let's back up, because to understand how religion lived in the daily life of an ordinary Egyptian, we need to understand something fundamental about how the Egyptians related to their gods, something that is deeply different from the way most modern people relate to religious belief. In ancient Egypt, the gods were not distant. They were not abstract principles accessible only through prayer and faith and the occasional glimpse of transcendence in a beautiful sunset. They were not confined to temples or sacred texts or special religious occasions. They were here, present, active, involved in the smallest details of daily life in ways both comforting and demanding. The Egyptians had a concept for this universal divine presence. They called it Heka. Heka was the fundamental force of magic and creation, a power so primordial that it predated the gods themselves, so total that it was present in everything, in the bread on the table, in the scorpion under the stone, in the words of a spell spoken in the right tone, in the amulet worn against the skin. Heka was the operating system of the universe, the invisible code that ran beneath every visible thing. And here is the crucial point. Heka was accessible, not just to pharaohs, not just to priests, not just to scholars who had spent years in temple schools, to everyone. A farmer could draw on Heka, a baker's wife could use it, a child could be protected by it. The divine power that ran the universe was not locked away behind walls of doctrine and hierarchy. It was available to any person, in any circumstance, who knew how to reach for it. This produced a religious culture that was, by the standards of the ancient world, and arguably by any standards, extraordinarily democratic. The gods of Egypt were everywhere, and their protection was available to anyone who sought it. The household shrine. In the houses excavated at Deir el-Medina, those wonderfully preserved mud brick homes that have given us such extraordinary insight into everyday Egyptian life. Archaeologists have found, in nearly every one of them, small recessed niches in the walls of the main living room. In these niches stood the household gods. Not the great gods of the state temples, not Amun in his gold-covered bark at Karnak, not Ra in his solar boat crossing the sky. Those gods were real and important and the subject of elaborate state ritual, but they were also remote, grand, operating at a cosmic scale that had less to do with whether your baby would survive the night than with whether Egypt itself would survive the year. The household gods were different, they were close, they were personal, and they were ugly in the most magnificent possible way. Chief among them was Bez. Bes was a dwarf deity, short, stocky, lion-faced, with a grotesque grinning expression, his tongue stuck out, his enormous eyes wide, every feature of his face arranged into the most ferocious, intimidating, deliberately alarming appearance possible. He wore a feathered crown and a leopard skin. He carried knives. He was, in his physical appearance, as far from our modern image of a beautiful, serene deity as it is possible to get. And he was beloved, absolutely beloved, because Bes was on your side. Bes protected mothers in childbirth. Bes guarded children against nightmares and evil spirits and the particular terrors of the small hours of the night. Bes protected the household against serpents and scorpions and the general malevolent interest of dark forces that, in the ancient Egyptian worldview, were always present and always looking for a gap in your defenses. His ugliness was not a flaw. It was his weapon. Evil spirits, encountering that grinning, tongue-out, knife-wielding face in the darkness, would, the Egyptians reasoned, be frightened off. What dark force would want to deal with Bes? He appeared on household walls, painted directly onto the plaster of the birthing room. He appeared as small clay figurines in the household niche. He appeared on the handles of knives used to draw protective circles around sleeping children. He appeared tattooed on the thighs of women, so that his protective power would be present at the moment of birth. We have the physical evidence of all of this: the figurines, the painted walls, the ivory wands, the tattoo patterns on female mummies. Bes was everywhere. And beside him in the household niche often stood Taweret. If Bes was the soldier of the household gods, Taweret was the protector of a different kind of vulnerability. She had the body of a pregnant hippopotamus, the tail of a crocodile, the paws and claws of a lioness, and she stood upright on her hind legs, one hand holding a protective symbol, her expression not fierce but watchful, the expression of a large, capable creature that will absolutely do whatever is necessary to protect what is hers. Taweret watched over pregnant women and newborn children. She was invoked at the moment of birth, her name spoken by the midwife or the wise woman attending the delivery, her figurine placed nearby for her protection. In a world where childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could experience, where infection and hemorrhage and difficult labor could and regularly did kill both mother and child, Tawaret's protective presence was not superstition. It was, within the framework of the Egyptian worldview, emergency services. The amulets. You could not be an ordinary Egyptian without amulets. They were as fundamental to personal appearance as clothing. We have found them in extraordinary numbers, thousands of them from excavations all over Egypt, in every material from gold to cheap glazed clay, in every size from objects barely larger than a fingernail to substantial pieces that must have been awkward to wear. The Eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, the Ankh, symbol of life, the Djed pillar, symbol of stability, the Chet knot of Isis, the heart amulet, the fish amulet worn by children to protect against drowning, the hand amulet, the headrest amulet placed under a mummy's head to ensure the dead person could lift their head in the afterlife. Each had a specific function, each drew on a specific divine power, and each could be activated had its protective energy heightened by a spell spoken at the moment of creation or the moment of dawning. A priest could bless an amulet, which was the strongest form, but a person could also speak a spell themselves at dawn, dawn being considered the most auspicious time for magical acts, the moment of daily renewal when Heka was most accessible, and activate the amulet's power with their own intention and the right words. Words mattered enormously in ancient Egypt. This connection ran so deep that Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, was sometimes said to be the inventor of Heka itself. That language and magic were, at their root, the same thing. A word spoken correctly in the right context, with the right intention, was not merely a sound, it was an act. It changed things, it reached into the fabric of reality and adjusted it. This is why spells in ancient Egypt were often not whispered or thought, but spoken aloud, sometimes at specific volumes, in specific tones, directed toward specific objects or people or the image of a specific god. The speaking was the magic. The word was the deed, and this gave enormous power to anyone who knew the right words. Let's talk about the scorpion charmer, because this is one of my favorite figures in all of ancient Egyptian daily life, a professional so specific, so practically necessary, and so quintessentially Egyptian that they deserve a moment all their own. Egypt is home to several species of scorpion, some of them dangerously venomous. In the society where people walked barefoot, where homes were built of mud brick with any number of dark crevices that scorpions found attractive, where children played on floors and adults slept on mats and farmers worked with their hands in the soil, scorpion stings were a real and regular danger. The Egyptian response to this was both practical and magical, woven together in the seamless way that characterizes so much of Egyptian life. There were people in Egypt whose specific profession was dealing with this problem. They were called scorpion charmers, and they were real, practiced professionals, recognized as a legitimate occupational category in the administrative records of the state. Their work combined two approaches that, to an Egyptian, were not separate. The first was practical. They knew scorpions. They knew where the creatures nested, what drew them, how to locate them, and remove them from a home. This was skilled pest control, based on genuine knowledge of scorpion behavior, and it worked on purely physical principles. The second was magical. They knew the spells. Specifically, they worked with the protective power of the goddess Serket, the scorpion goddess, whose domain was precisely the management of venomous creatures. A scorpion charmer who had been stung or who was treating someone who had been stung would combine the application of whatever physical remedy was available, poultices, herbal treatments, described in medical papyri in careful detail, with the recitation of spells that invoked Serket's power and enlisted it against the venom. This was not considered irrational or contradictory. The illness had a physical component and a supernatural component. You treated both. The medical papyri of ancient Egypt, the Edwin Smith papyrus, the Ebers papyrus, the Cahun gynecological papyrus, contain some of the most sophisticated medical thinking of the ancient world, sitting comfortably alongside magical spells and divine invocations. A doctor examining a head wound would note its physical characteristics, classify its severity, prescribe a specific physical treatment, and then, in the same breath, recommend a specific spell to be spoken over the patient. The two were not competing systems. They were two aspects of the same comprehensive response to illness, because illness had two causes, physical and supernatural, and therefore required two kinds of treatment. The Egyptians were, in this sense, thoroughgoing. They left nothing to chance. Now, the festivals. If amulets and household shrines were religion as private practice, the quiet, daily negotiation between an ordinary person and their gods, then the great religious festivals were religion as public spectacle, as community, as the moment when the normally invisible divine world became, for a few extraordinary days, visible to everyone. The most important festival in Thebes, and arguably in all of Egypt during the New Kingdom, was the Opet festival. It took place during the second month of the flood season, when the Nile was at or near its peak and the fields were underwater, and there was a pause in the most intense agricultural labor. The timing was not accidental. The flooding was the renewal of the land. The Opet festival was the renewal of the divine order. They happened together. And here is what it looked like. Imagine standing in the street in Thebes, on the processional route between the great temple complex of Karnak and the Luxor temple, 2 kilometers to the south. The avenue between the two temples was lined with Sphinx statues, hundreds of them, creating a corridor of stone that turned an ordinary city street into a sacred path. On the day the festival began, the gates of Karnak opened, and out came the gods. Not the gods themselves, not in any directly visible form, but their statues, their cult images, carried in elaborately decorated portable barks on the shoulders of shaven-headed priests who moved in careful measured steps, the sacred weight balanced between them. The bark of Amun, the king of the gods, the hidden one, the supreme deity of Thebes, came first. It was covered in gold. Its prow and stern were shaped as rams' heads, the animal sacred to Amun. Incense burned in braziers around it. Priests walked alongside shaking sistrums, the musical rattles used in religious ritual, and chanting. Behind Amun came his consort Mut. Behind Mut came their son, the moon god Khonsu. The divine family of Thebes, moving together through the city they protected, and the city turned out to meet them. Ordinary Egyptians, who never entered the inner sanctuaries of the great temples, who spent their entire lives outside the walls of those sacred spaces, shut out by the hierarchies of the priesthood, on this day could stand in the street and watch the gods go by. They could shout petitions, they could present offerings, they could, if the bark came close enough to the crowd, try to touch the sacred wood of the carrying poles. The procession took most of the day. Musicians played, acrobats performed. Dancers moved alongside the priests, their bodies bent in the ecstatic postures visible in temple reliefs, carved during the reigns of Tutankhamun and Ramesses II, who each added their own visual records of the festival to the temple walls. And at either end of the route, food was distributed to the people: bread, beer, meat. Not in small token amounts, but in genuine quantities, a redistribution of the temple's resources to the community that it served, a visible demonstration of the gods' generosity toward their people. By the reign of Ramesses III, the Opet festival lasted 24 days. 24 days of celebration, music, religious ritual, feasting, and the extraordinary experience of seeing the divine world come out from behind its walls and walk in the street alongside the ordinary people of the city. It was the greatest party of the year, and it was also, simultaneously, a cosmological event. The annual renewal of the divine kingship, the reaffirmation of the pharaoh's role as the living son of Amun, the ritual that ensured the continuation of the world for another year. The Egyptians managed, with the Opet festival, to be simultaneously having the time of their lives and sustaining the cosmic order. This was perhaps their greatest achievement. Deir. There was another festival that was quieter, more intimate, more personal. It was called the Beautiful Festival of the Valley. It took place on the West Bank, the Sacred Bank, the Bank of the Dead, and it was, in its essence, a festival in which the living went to visit the dead. The cult statue of Amun crossed the Nile on this day and travelled to the necropolis on the Western Bank, stopping at the great mortuary temples, visiting the tombs of deceased pharaohs and private citizens alike. And the people of Thebes crossed with it. Families came to their ancestors' tombs. They came bearing food and flowers and offerings of every kind. They cleaned the tomb chapels, made offerings at the false door through which the dead received sustenance from the living world, burned incense, lit lamps. They ate and drank with their dead, literally setting out food as if for a shared meal, eating and drinking beside the tomb while the dead were believed to partake of the spiritual essence of the offerings. And then, in the evening, many of them stayed. They slept in the tomb chapels overnight, practicing what scholars call incubation, sleeping in a sacred space in the deliberate hope of receiving a dream message from the dead or from the gods. In the morning, the dream would be analyzed and interpreted. The ancestors had spoken, the gods had communicated, the business of the living had been conducted with the help of the dead. This festival was called beautiful not because it was solemn, though it was also solemn, but because it was joyful. The Egyptians did not fear their dead the way many cultures have feared theirs. The dead were family. They were present, accessible, interested in the welfare of those they had left behind. The beautiful festival of the valley was not a day of grief. It was a reunion. A word about the dead. Because the Egyptian relationship with death and with the dead is one of the most misunderstood aspects of their civilization. We tend to look at the elaborate tomb preparations, the mummification, the vast expenditure of wealth and labor on funerary equipment, and we read it as an obsession with death, a civilization afraid of dying, desperately constructing elaborate magical systems to deny the inevitable. But that is not what it was. The Egyptians were not obsessed with death. They were obsessed with life. The entire elaborate machinery of Egyptian funerary practice existed not because they feared death, but because they loved life so much that they refused to accept it could simply end. The tomb was not a place of final rest. It was a launching pad, a transition point. The mummy, carefully preserved, was not a monument to death, but a physical anchor for the soul, a home to which the Ba, the individual personality that could fly free of the body during sleep and after death, could always return and be sustained. The Ka, the life force, the energy, needed offerings of food and drink to sustain it in the afterlife, which is why tomb chapels had offering tables, and why relatives came to leave offerings, and why the false door in the tomb wall was designed as a symbolic threshold through which the spiritual essence of those offerings could pass to the dead. The Book of the Dead, that great collection of spells and guidance for navigating the afterlife, was not a morbid text. It was a travel guide. Here are the challenges you will face. Here are the words that will get you past the guardians. Here is what you need to say when your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Here is how to reach the field of reeds. The field of reeds. This is what waited at the end of the journey. Not an abstract spiritual state, not a vague communion with the divine. A specific, physical-seeming place, described in careful detail. A landscape of green fields and clear water and fruit trees, where the grain grew taller than a man, and the sun was never too hot, and the people you had loved in life were present, and everything was as it should be. The Egyptian afterlife was not different from life. It was life perfected. You would still farm, you would still eat bread and drink beer. You would still play sinet, still sit in the shade of a fig tree, still watch the water move. But none of it would be hard, none of it would hurt. The flood would always be exactly right. The harvest would always be abundant. Your teeth would stop hurting, forever. There is something deeply, movingly human about this vision of eternity. Not heaven as a disembodied spiritual state, not paradise as an escape from the physical world. Heaven as the physical world made right. As everything you love about being alive, without any of the suffering. The Egyptians looked at their lives, the grinding grain and the hot sun and the crocodiles in the river and the scorpions under the stones and the tax collector at the threshing floor and the child who died too young and the tooth that had hurt for a year. And they said, "We want this. We want exactly this. We just want it to be better." It is perhaps the most honest vision of the afterlife any civilization has ever produced, not a denial of the physical world, a love letter to it. The evening prayer. In ancient Egypt, the evening was not just the end of the workday. It was a moment of religious transition, the sun setting in the west, entering the underworld for its nightly journey, the moment of daily death and daily resurrection, that was the central metaphor of Egyptian religious life. The sun died every evening. The sun was reborn every morning. The continuity of that cycle, the daily promise that the sun would rise again, was the foundation on which Egyptian religious confidence rested. Ra, the sun god, did not simply travel through the sky. He fought for it. Every night, in the underworld, Ra's solar boat navigated a 12-hour journey through a realm of darkness and danger, confronting, and every single night defeating, the great serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos and dissolution, whose only desire was to swallow the sun and plunge the world into permanent darkness. Ra won. Every single night Ra won, and every morning the world was renewed. But, and this was crucial, and this was where ordinary people came in, he needed help. The morning ritual at every temple in Egypt was not merely a celebration of Ra's victory, it was, in part, a contribution to it. The priests performing the morning offering ceremony, opening the sanctuary, presenting food and incense and song to the god statue, they were helping to fuel the divine machinery that kept the world running. Prayer was not just communication with the gods, it was maintenance. It was keeping the cosmic engine turning. And this meant that the prayers of ordinary people, said at the household shrine before the figure of Bez at the start of the day, or whispered before sleep with an amulet held against the chest, or offered silently at the small public shrines set into the outer walls of the great temples for exactly this purpose, were not empty gestures. They were real contributions to the work of sustaining the world. The ordinary Egyptian praying before their household shrine in the early morning was not asking for personal favors from an indifferent universe. They were doing their part. One last story from the world of Egyptian religion. It is a letter, a real letter written on papyrus, addressed to a dead person. The Egyptians wrote letters to their dead, not metaphorically. Actual physical letters, written in ink on papyrus or ostraca, left at tomb chapels or placed in offering bowls, addressed to deceased spouses or parents or children, explaining a problem in the living person's life and asking for the dead person's assistance in resolving it from the other side. We have these letters, a small collection, preserved by the desert, of the most quietly heartbreaking documents in the ancient world. One is a letter from a man to his dead wife. He wrote it because he was having trouble, bad dreams perhaps, or illness, or a persistent run of bad luck. The specific problem is not entirely clear from the surviving text, and he had come to believe, as Egyptians sometimes did, that his dead wife might be responsible, not out of malice. The Egyptians understood that the dead did not always know the effect they were having on the living. A dead person who missed someone desperately who wanted their company might, without intending harm, draw the living person toward illness or misfortune, pulling them toward the realm of the dead out of love. So he wrote to her. He reminded her of how good their life together had been. He reminded her of everything he had done for her while she was alive, the food he had brought, the care he had taken of her during her illness. The fact that he had not taken another wife while she was sick. The fact that he had provided everything properly for her burial. He was not angry. He was not accusing. He was a man, alone, having a hard time, writing a letter to his wife. He asked her gently to stop. He missed her. He would always miss her. But he needed to be well. He needed to get on with the living. The letter was placed at her tomb. And then he went home. 3,000 years later, a scholar unfolded it from where it had been lying in a museum collection for decades, looked at the careful, slightly unsteady hieratic handwriting and began to read, and felt across the vast distance of millennia the specific quality of a grief that has nowhere else to go but paper. It is late now. The city has grown quiet. The last of the lamps have gone out in the neighboring houses. The stars over Thebes are extraordinary, dense and cold and silver in a sky unpolluted by any light but their own. The Milky Way a visible river of brightness from horizon to horizon. The way it would look, undimmed, for another 3,000 years. In the household shrine niche, the little figure of Bess stands in the dark, still watching, still grinning, still keeping vigil against whatever the night might bring. The scorpion charmer has made his rounds. The amulets are in place. The evening prayers have been said. The dead have been fed, their names spoken aloud as the offering was made, so that the sound of their names in the air of the world would sustain their presence in the next. The Heka of the universe runs through everything, visible and invisible. Through the sleeping children and the dying lamp and the cooling bread and the Nile murmuring somewhere below the city and the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient predicted paths. Ra is in the underworld now. He is fighting. He will win. He always wins. And in the morning, without fail, the light will come again. Trust it. Close your eyes. Trust it. Come back with me to the rooftop. The same rooftop where we began all those hours ago, the mud brick house in Thebes, the flat roof still cool from the night before, the street below beginning to stir with the first sounds of morning. A goat, a distant voice, the low rhythmic scraping of grain on stone, the copper and gold sky, the last stars fading, the smell of the Nile drifting over the rooftops of the city like a slow, warm wave. We started here, and it is right to end here too, because this is where Egypt actually lived, not in the throne room, not in the inner sanctuary of the temple where only the highest priests were permitted to enter, not in the gold-covered burial chamber of a pharaoh sealed behind 7 doors and buried under 1,000,000 tons of limestone. Here, on this rooftop, in this ordinary morning, in the smell of bread beginning to bake, and the sound of the city waking and the weight of the day settling onto the shoulders of the people who would carry it. This is where Egypt was, every single day for 3,000 years. Let's be honest about what happened to it, because Egypt did not go on forever. Nothing does. And the way this civilization ended, the long, slow, complicated way it dissolved into other things, rather than simply stopping, is itself a story worth telling. The great days of the New Kingdom, the days of Ramesses II and his temples, of Tutankhamun and his golden throne, of Nefertiti and her painted limestone face, began to fade around 1100 BCE. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way a very long afternoon fades into evening, so gradually that you don't notice, until suddenly the light is different, and the shadows are long, and something has changed without announcing itself. The last truly powerful native pharaohs were the Ramessides. After Ramesses III, who fought off 3 massive invasion attempts in his first decade of rule by the mysterious sea peoples, by the Libyans, by threats from every direction. The throne passed to a succession of rulers who carried the name Ramesses, but not the force. Ramesses IV, VI, VII, VIII, IX, Indi, each one weaker than the last. The Deir el-Medina workers' rations grew more irregular. The Valley of the Kings grew harder to defend. The first systematic tomb robbing began, and when the investigators were sent to look into it, they found that some of the thieves were the workers themselves. The men who had built the tombs were now looting them. This is not a story of villains. It is a story of hungry people in a failing system, making the choices that hungry people in failing systems have always made. The priests of Amun grew powerful enough in this period to effectively split the country. Upper Egypt was governed by the high priest of Amun at Thebes, a man with the authority of a king in everything but name. Lower Egypt was governed by pharaohs in their northern capital. The country that had been unified for 1,000 years divided quietly along the seam of geography and power that had always been there, waiting. Then came the outsiders, the Kushites, from what is now Sudan, who had absorbed Egyptian culture so deeply over centuries of contact that they were, in many ways, more Egyptian than the Egyptians, swept north in the 8th century BCE and conquered the whole country. They built pyramids, they worshipped Amun. They tried with genuine devotion to restore the traditions of the new kingdom that they so admired. Then the Assyrians came, hard, military, efficient. They did not try to be Egyptian. They installed vassal kings and extracted tribute and moved on. Then the Persians. Then, in 332 BCE, a young Macedonian general rode into Egypt and was greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, exhausted by Persian rule, welcomed Alexander. He visited the oracle of Amun in the desert oasis of Siwa. The oracle told him he was the son of Amun. He was delighted. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast and named it, with characteristic modesty, after himself, Alexandria. And in Alexandria, something extraordinary happened. Greek culture and Egyptian culture met and fused into something new, a hybrid civilization of astonishing intellectual vitality. The Library of Alexandria, the great lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, mathematics and medicine and philosophy and literature and art, cross-pollinating across 2 traditions, producing things that neither could have produced alone. The pharaohs of this era, the Ptolemies, Alexander's successors, dressed as Egyptian kings for official purposes, presented offerings to the Egyptian gods in the traditional manner, had their names written in hieroglyphic cartouches on the temple walls. They were Greek in their private lives and Egyptian in their public ones, and under their rule, some of the most beautiful temples in Egypt were built. Philae, Edfu, Dendera, Kom-Ombo, temples that stand in extraordinary preservation today, their painted walls still vivid, their hieroglyphic inscriptions still legible, and then Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, the only one in 3 centuries of Greek rule who learned to speak Egyptian, who spoke 7 languages total, who presented herself not as a Greek queen ruling Egypt, but as the goddess Isis incarnate, as a true daughter of the ancient civilization she governed. When she died in 30 BCE, following the defeat of Mark Antony's forces by the future Emperor Augustus, Egypt became a Roman province, and something that had lasted 3,000 years was over. But was it? Here is the thing about the end of ancient Egypt that is easy to miss when you tell it as a story of military conquest and political collapse. The people didn't stop. The farmers along the Nile kept farming. The craftsmen kept crafting. The women ground their grain, and the beer fermented in its jars, and the children played with their wooden toys, and the Nile flooded every summer exactly as it always had. The bodies of the dead were still mummified, though for fewer and fewer generations. The temples still operated, though under Roman administration rather than pharaonic authority. The old gods were still worshipped alongside the new Roman gods, the 2 pantheons coexisting in the pragmatic way that polytheistic traditions have always managed to coexist. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved on the island of Philae in 394 CE, nearly 5 centuries after Cleopatra's death. Nearly 4 centuries after the birth of Christ, the tradition lasted longer than the Roman Empire itself would last in the West. And then even that fell silent. The ability to read hieroglyphics was lost. The priests who had carried the knowledge of the script for 3,500 years were gone. The writing that covered every temple wall, every tomb, every monument in Egypt became, for 14 centuries, a beautiful and total mystery. Scholars guessed, travelers wondered. Napoleon scholars measured and drew and theorized, and none of them could read a word, until 1822, when a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, working from the multilingual Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon's soldiers in 1799, cracked the code. He could read hieroglyphics. The silence of 14 centuries was broken in an afternoon. Champollion reportedly wept. He ran through the streets of Paris to find his brother and collapsed, saying only, "I've done it." Then he fainted. The dead came back. Think about what that means. Think about Mira, the pyramid inspector, whose papyrus had been folded in a cave for 4,000 years. Think about Naunacht and her angry will. Think about the attendance record of a menacht, with its entry for the worker who was simply absent, no reason given. Think about the love poems of the Cairo collection, with their heartbreaking freshness. Think about the man who wrote to his dead wife and asked her gently to let him go. All of them silent for centuries. All of them speaking again. Every tomb wall that a visitor to Egypt passes today, in the Valley of the Kings, in the great temples of Luxor and Karnak, in the tiny, perfect rooms of the workers' tombs at Deir el-Medina, every wall is covered in words that were once unreadable and are now open again. Every inscription that a guide translates for a group of tourists standing in the half-dark of a corridor cut 3,000 years ago. That translation is the direct result of one man's life work and one morning's extraordinary breakthrough. The Egyptians themselves would have understood this. They believed that the spoken name was what kept the dead alive. Say the name, they believed, and the person lives again in some real sense, their energy sustained by the act of being remembered. For 14 centuries their names went unspoken. And now, every day, in every language, by visitors from every corner of a world they could not have imagined, those names are spoken again. Tutankhamun, Nefertiti, Rameses, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Sennacherib, Naunakhte, Mera, Amenacht, said out loud, every day. Let me tell you what ancient Egypt gave us, not as an academic exercise, as a real accounting of the presence of this civilization in the world we currently inhabit. The calendar you use every day, the 365-day solar calendar, organized into 12 months, with an extra quarter day accounted for in the leap year, traces its direct lineage through the Roman calendar that Julius Caesar reformed to the Egyptian calendar he used as his model. The Roman calendar was based on the Egyptian. The calendar is Egyptian, the 24-hour day. The Egyptians divided their day into 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark, a division that has traveled through Greek astronomy and Roman timekeeping and medieval scholarship into the digital clock on your phone. The hours you keep are Egyptian hours, the mathematics. Geometry as a practical discipline, the measurement of land after the annual flood, the calculation of building volumes, the precise orientation of structures to the cardinal points, was pioneered in Egypt and absorbed by Greek mathematicians who visited and studied and returned home with new tools. Pythagoras, by ancient tradition, spent years in Egypt before formulating the mathematics we now teach to schoolchildren under his name. The medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, that extraordinary clinical text with its systematic examination of injuries and its ruthless honesty about which wounds are hopeless, was translated into Greek, influenced Greek medical writers, and through them influenced the entire subsequent tradition of Western medicine. The idea that illness has natural causes, that it can be examined systematically, that some conditions can be treated and others cannot, and that a good doctor should be honest about the difference. This idea was already ancient in Egypt when Hippocrates was born. The writing. The alphabet you are using right now, the one in which these words are formed, traces its ancestry through Phoenician and early Semitic scripts to the influence of Egyptian writing on the cultures of the ancient Near East. The connection is complex and debated in its details, but the Egyptian writing system was the most sophisticated and influential in the ancient world, and its presence in the region created the conditions from which alphabetic writing emerged. And the monuments. The pyramids and temples and obelisks of Egypt have been inspiring wonder, scholarship, imitation, and obsession for as long as other civilizations have encountered them. The Romans brought obelisks to Rome, where many still stand. The Renaissance was partly sparked by European scholars trying to decode the hieroglyphics they had seen carved on those obelisks. The obelisk in the center of St. Peter's Square in the Vatican is an ancient Egyptian monument, quarried during the reign of a pharaoh who died before Rome existed as a city. Egypt is everywhere. It is in the hours of your day, in the shape of the year, in the mathematics of your phone's processor, in the alphabet on every page you have ever read. It did not end in 30 BCE. It became everything else. And what about the ordinary people? Nefertari at her grinding stone, Ka at his temple bakery, Neb watching the flood, the boy walking to his first day of scribal school, carrying his limestone chips and his palette, the worker who was drunk on Tuesday and painted something magnificent on Wednesday, Naunakte, old and angry and completely within her rights, the man writing a careful letter to his dead wife in the small hours of the night. What about them? Here is what I want you to take from this long journey through a civilization that no longer exists and yet is somehow everywhere. Those people were not fundamentally different from us. I know that is a thing people say about history, and it can start to feel like a platitude, like a comfortable, reassuring thought that we reach for without really examining it. But I mean it precisely, specifically. I mean it in the details. The woman sitting at a grinding stone before sunrise, thinking about her daughter's future, is doing something you have done. Not the specific action. You have probably not ground Emma wheat on a saddle quern, but the specific shape of the experience. Waking before you need to, doing the work that sustains the people you love while they are still asleep, thinking about their futures while your hands are busy with something immediate. That experience is 3,000 years old, and it happened this morning in your time zone. The boy in the scribal school, copying the same passage for the 100th time, wondering if all this effort will actually lead somewhere, feeling the frustration of learning something that hasn't clicked yet. That experience is not ancient. That experience is happening right now in classrooms on every continent. The worker who gave no reason for his absence, who just didn't show up, who let the scribe write his name in the column and move on. You have been that person, or you have managed that person, or you have been the scribe, sighing slightly and writing the name and moving on, because what else do you do? The man who fought with his neighbor for 11 years over a property dispute in a village small enough that they passed each other at the well every morning. That man's stubbornness is not exotic. It is Wednesday. It is the comment thread on any online forum. It is every family gathering where that one topic doesn't get mentioned because it hasn't been resolved since 2014. These people are us. They are us, translated into linen and mud brick and the smell of a river that gave them everything. The sun is fully up over Thebes now. The city is in its full morning rush. The market is open. The boats are moving on the river. The temple gates are ajar, and the priests are at their morning ritual, presenting the gods breakfast in the golden inner light of the sanctuary, chanting the words that help the cosmic engine turn for another day. In the workers' village, the team that spent the last 8 days in the valley has come home. They are crossing the path from the valley gate now, tired and dusty and ready for 2 days of rest. Some of them are already thinking about the beer that is waiting at home. One of them is composing in his head the complaint he is going to write on a limestone chip tonight about the way the grain was distributed last week. In the scribal school, a boy is bent over his work. The teacher has gone to get water. The boy, left alone for a moment, turns his limestone chip over and quickly draws something on the back. Not a letter, not a practice passage, just a drawing. A cat, maybe, a face. Something that is entirely his own, done in 30 seconds while no one is watching. On the rooftop of a house in the craftsman's quarter, a woman is checking the grain laid out to dry in the early sun. She looks out over the city, the rooftops and the river and the distant glint of gold from the tip of a temple obelisk catching the light. And for a moment, she is simply here. Present. Not working, not worrying, not planning, just here, watching the light move over the city that her labor sustains. 3,000 years from now, someone is going to find a limestone chip with a drawing of a cat on it, brushed clean of sand and held to the light. And they will know she was here. Andreid, you've been listening for a long time, and maybe by now your eyes are heavy and the world around you has grown soft at the edges, and Thebes feels both very far away and somehow, strangely, close. That's the right feeling. Because this is what history does when it is told the right way. It doesn't separate us from the past. It folds us into it. It shows us that the long chain of ordinary human days stretches back much further than we usually let ourselves feel. That we are not the first to lie awake thinking about our children's futures, not the first to love someone so much that we write letters to them after they are gone, not the first to do something beautiful in a place where no one will see it, just because it mattered to us to do it well. We are the newest link in a chain that goes back to the first grain ground on the first stone, to the first fire lit in the first cold dawn, to the first hand that pressed itself into wet clay and looked at its own print and felt the strange, quiet satisfaction of having left something that was entirely itself in the world. The Egyptians understood permanence better than anyone. They built in stone because they wanted things to last. But the truest things they left us are not in stone. They are in a boy's drawing on the back of his homework, in a woman's handprint on a tomb wall, in a folded question placed before an oracle, in a letter to the dead, in the sound of grain on a grinding stone at 5 in the morning while the city sleeps. These things lasted not because they were carved in the hardest stone in the right temple with the right formula. They lasted because they were true, and true things last. Sleep well.
Before you go, a word from us. If you've made it this far, through the bread and the beer, through the flood and the pyramids,
through Peneb's spectacular catalogue of offences and Naunakte's very justified anger, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Thank you for spending these hours in ancient Egypt with us. Now, before you drift off completely, we have a small favor to ask. If this story kept you company tonight, if at any point you found yourself genuinely surprised or genuinely moved or genuinely thinking, I had no idea, consider leaving a like. It takes 2 seconds and it tells us and the algorithm that stories like this are worth making. And if you want more nights like this one, more long, slow journeys into the real lives of real people in the ancient world, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We have stories about the Black Death and the extraordinary world that came after it, about what it was really like to live in medieval Europe, not the version from movies, the real one, about the daily lives of ordinary people in ancient Rome, in the Ottoman Empire, in feudal Japan. Long stories, quiet stories, the kind of stories that are good to fall asleep to. They're coming, and we'd love for you to be there when they arrive. One last thing. Right now, wherever you are listening to this, whether it is a bedroom in the middle of the night, or a train moving through a dark landscape, or a sofa with the lamp turned low and the rest of the house quiet, you are part of something that the ancient Egyptians would have found completely extraordinary and entirely natural at the same time. A story being told, across an unimaginable distance of time and space, to someone who needed to hear it. Drop a comment and tell us where you are. We're curious, not just about your city or your country, about the hour. About what your night looks like, about whether it is raining where you are, or cold, or whether the stars are visible. The Egyptians believed that the stars were the souls of the dead, watching over the living. They would have liked knowing that someone, somewhere, is lying in the dark tonight, thinking about the woman with the grinding stone, and the man with the borrowed cloak, and the boy who drew a cat on the back of his homework. Tell us where you are. We'll be listening. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for being here.